Earnings growth, certainly, but has the earnings growth been good enough to kind of keep pace with where we are? So how do you think about valuation?
Well, I think the valuation, you can talk yourself into things being fairly or even a little bit below valuation if you believe, and this is a big if, the Fed is going to cut rates. And this is the math part of this segment here. Once we have lower rates, we get higher multiples. It's just how it works because we discount those cash flows back at a lower interest rate, not a higher interest rate, and you have to accept higher multiples. And I think that's part of this game in this market right now is just about every last person, retail investor and institutional investors are all assuming the Fed's going to cut sooner rather than later.
When the Fed cuts, what then looks interesting in a way that it doesn't look now? Like, is that when small caps finally get some action?
I hope so. I love small caps, and I think you should be invested in small caps regardless of what the Fed is doing. It was awfully hard when the Fed was raising rates and being into small caps, but good things happen to small, high quality companies. And what I mean by that is they either grow into big companies because they have what it takes to satisfy customers and grow, or they get bought by larger companies. And both of those things are going to happen when rates decrease. That is, companies being more willing to buy, to acquire product lines or companies that they want to add to their portfolio, or just growth in general should start going once that rate cut happens. So all good things come from rate cuts, apparently.
All right, Kim, thank you so much for joining us. Kim Forrest, founder and chief investment officer, Boca Capital Partners, located in Pittsburgh. Kim Forrest, founder and chief investment officer there. So there's another investor loving the AI trade. And, I guess it's not just the chips. You can go software plays, whether it's Microsoft or somebody else. Some of the hardware plays.
Exactly.
We've seen some hardware companies call it out.
So like the telecom angle that you had. I heard that one before.
Not heard that. Now,
there's
the energy angle, which we have the energy angle on utilities and some of the other
and the power
things.
trade.
It just seems like you can bend this thing any way you like to support where you are.
And I feel like the theory is that, at some point we'll come back down to earth, but then you have Julian Emmanuel upgrading his forecast to 6,000, being like the AI trade, it's too sticky.
Yep.
And that I feel like you're finally seeing that analyst capitulation at the end of the day to the broader market angle.
Yep, absolutely. And we look at the markets today. For Lisa Abramowitz listening, who hates this term, unched on the S&P 500. Nothing happening there. The Dow's off 59 points. The Nasdaq's off 1 point. Not a lot happening out there on the equity front, but that's okay. With our news in New York City, here's Michael Barr.
Thank you very much, Paul, Alex, and Lisa. Firefighters in northern Los Angeles County are trying to gain some control on a wildfire that started on Saturday and has exploded to over 14,000 acres. Last night, the fire spread when the wind shifted and the flames went raging mainly in rugged mountain terrain, now far from any homes. But Interstate 5 in California was shut down again overnight because of flames along the heavily traveled freeway that connects northern and southern California. High wind and low humidity are expected throughout the day again today. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says he will bring to vote to ban bump stocks this week. Bloomberg's Ed Baxter has more.
This just days after the Supreme Court invalidated a federal rule that outlawed the devices.
By undoing this most common sense safety ban on deadly bump stocks, this MAGA Supreme Court has shown the American people how dangerously to the far right they have gone.
And says there is no need for them.
It makes it from a regular weapon, a semi-automatic, into almost the equivalent of an automatic weapon, machine gun-like.
He says he will call for unanimous consent. Ed Baxter, Bloomberg Radio.
The U.S. Surgeon General has called on Congress to require warning labels on social media platforms, similar to those now mandatory on cigarette boxes. In an op-ed piece today for the New York Times, Dr. Vivek Murthy said that social media is a contributing factor in the mental health crisis among young people. Maryland Governor Wes Moore plans to issue more than 175,000 pardons for marijuana convictions today. The Washington Post reports the Democratic governor says he sees it as an opportunity to right a lot of historical wrongs. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. We have little movement in stocks right now, and this is as U.S. stock bulls. Well, they got even bolder. You had Goldman boosted its year-end target for the S&P 500 to 5,600. Evercore upped its call to about 6,000. Right now, we'll check in with the S&P 500. It's a little change. We have it down about 2 points at 5,429. The Dow down about 0.1%, 74 points at 38,516. The NASDAQ, little change, down about 4 points, 17,684. We have the two-year yield, 4.74%. That's up 3 basis points. The yield on the 10-year, 4.29%, and that's up 6 basis points. With commodities, we have spot gold lower, 2,324 an ounce. We have Brent crude, $83 a barrel. We have WTI crude at $79 a barrel. At movie theaters, they finally had their biggest film debut since Barbie. Alex saw it. Yeah, we're talking about Pixar's Inside Out 2. Pulled in $295 million globally, $155 million in the U.S. and Canada. We have Disney shares up about 1.5%. AMC Theater said it posted its highest attendance admissions revenue Thursday through Sunday. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Alex.
All right. Yes, it was really good. Next up, Deadpool versus Wolverine. I'll be calling out sick that day, by the way, just FYI. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. We're broadcasting to you live from our Interactive Broker Studio right here in Midtown Manhattan. We also have with us Jed Walentis. He's a Two Trees Management Principal. It is a private company that focuses on real estate. It's a family-owned real estate development firm, owned, managed, developed a portfolio that's now worth more than $4 billion in real estate. And today, Two Trees currently owns and manages more than 4,000 apartments and an additional 3 million square feet of commercial and industrial real estate all throughout New York City. Hey, Jed, it's great to have you in the studio.
Thanks for having me. Good morning.
How's it going? Like, where is business awesome? Where is business not awesome?
I was going to say it's going great. It's a beautiful day. But, where is business awesome? Where is business not awesome? You know, I'm an optimist. I find business to generally be awesome. We're doing kind of 3 sectors of the market right now. We're doing a lot of residential, both on the rental side and the condo side. We're selling our first condos in 20 years right now. We just opened a big 600-unit building that's 160 condos and 400 plus rentals. So just people moved in over the weekend.
Where's that?
At our Domino complex in South Williamsburg.
Okay,
so we own
the Domino,
the old
sugar.
Domino sugar refinery.
Okay, so
exactly.
for folks that aren't looking across the East River like we do at the Domino, there used to be a big sugar plant.
Used to be a big sugar plant. It refined 98% of North America's sugar 120 years ago.
Okay.
And it's amazing down there. Like, that whole area is incredible now.
Thank you very much. So we've spent the last 12, 14 years redeveloping it. We built a 6-acre park, and it built a series of 5 buildings now, mostly residential, some commercial. So just literally this weekend opened the most recent residential building, which has both condo and rental. Those markets are very strong. Even our condo sales are exemplary so far. The product is really excellent. We're proud of it. And also doing the refinery building adjacent. This is the actual old building, the landmark building where the sugar was refined. There were some ancillary buildings that we took down. And we built that as a spec office building, you know, through COVID. I have a partner. I run the company with my best friend from college, Amish. He was like, "You're insane, dude." And you know, we're doing remarkably well. I think the office market is like everything, right? It's very complex, and it's not one thing. I think for large companies in lots of parts of Manhattan, it's a struggle. Yeah. I think companies are downsizing. I think a lot of companies bid off more space than they can chew and are really in contraction mode, whether they want to admit that publicly or not. And it would have been, I think, great for the region for us to attract a headquarters tenant from Manhattan or from somewhere else in the world to come to Brooklyn. I think it would have been an amazing story. Instead, we're kind of doing what we did in Dumbo for the last 25 years, where we have 2 million feet of office, and that's catered to the 3,000 to 10,000 foot market, and just do what we call pre-builts. We've already filled up 2 full floors in the last 6 months. We just started building 2 more. We have another 10,000 foot lease that went to lease last week. So just kind of relentless incrementalism of leasing. And the great thing about New York is there are always thousands of people with new ideas starting new companies. So it's not the normal part of the commercial market. It relies a little less heavily on brokers. You have no idea what the credit of the tenant is, but we treat them a little like apartments, right? There's not that much TI, there's not that much specialization of work. So if they go poof in the middle of the night, it's pretty easy to re-rent the spaces. And I'm not a macro believer in diversification. You know, all our businesses in New York, we're very much in the, you know, mind our eggs closely, keep them all in one basket and mind them closely camp. But from a tenant standpoint on the commercial side, it really works. We don't do any underwriting on who these people are, you know, but we also limit the capital outlay, so you can't get too hurt.
Can New York City, broadly defined, and your focus is Brooklyn, can there be too much residential units? It seems like this city just sucks it all up.
Well,
I mean, you can't find, I mean, my daughter, the young people today, like when I was living in the city, we had 2- and 3-year leases. The kids today only have 1-year lease. You guys screw them every 12 months, and I got to deal with it as a parent and hear about it all the time.
I hear you. You
guys just can't build enough of them, can you?
Well, I mean, the truth is on the residential side, the city's underbuilt, right? I mean, it's very fundamental supply and demand, and everyone likes to get mad at the landlords. And the truth is that government has artificially created a cartel, right?
Well, what does that mean?
They've created a regulated limited industry. There are only 10 or 15 of us who can really deal with the politics and the access to capital and all the headaches that it takes to build in this part of the world. And you have all this regulation, zoning, landmarks, all the things pile on, government, you know, death by 1,000 cuts. It makes it so difficult, so expensive to build that we radically underproduce supply. And as a result, we can charge too much money. You know, I mean, and government then goes and, you know, says, oh, well, the landlords are doing this and that, right? The truth is it's 75 years, 80 years of bad public policy has just exacerbated that supply-demand imbalance every year, and the cumulative impact of that is $4,500 studio apartments.
So what's it, if you just opened some residential, you said over the weekend, what was the time frame start to finish to kind of get people moving in?
So our project is a little unique in that it's part of a kind of master plan development. But this site we bought in 2012. It took us 2 years to get it rezoned. We only build one building at a time. We build for ourselves. We use our own money. We don't have any partners. We don't have any third-party equity. So we only do, you know, these projects are $500, $600, $700 million a pop. So we do one project at a time. So, I mean, at face value, this project was 12, 14 years in the making. That's not fully fair because we've been layering on other buildings as we go. But it's very, you know, the average project is probably 5, 7, 8 years.
And if I were to do that in Nashville, that would be
less than half. I mean, and most cities.
So what's the main thing? Like, is it just like, what would you need to cut that time and cost down?
I mean, the reason it's hard is that there's not one main thing. It's really, it's a little bit the relationship with union labor. It's a little bit all the hoops you have to jump through with the city of New York, the building department, fire department. And most people, none of the individual components are malicious, in my opinion, on their own. But there's nobody in charge saying, we need to go build more housing and it's a crisis and let's like cut through all the nonsense and all the bullshit and figure out like actual solutions. And everyone, at every moment, there are reasonable things to hide behind. Oh, we need to hide behind safety on this. We need to do this. And they're not all irrational, but the cumulative impact is horrifying, and the impact to the rental community and to your kids getting out of college and is catastrophic, and it's very, very bad for the region. And the other problem is that our industry is, as you just asked, right? The gestation period of these projects is long, and elected officials' time horizons and attention spans are short. And if they can't see the impact of a new project being positive in 12, 24, 36 months, as opposed in terms of, oh, more supply is going to push rents down, they're not going to go for that. And the thing is, we need so much supply built to push the rents down that the optics in moment one are, more development is good for the developer.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Jed, thank you so much for joining us. Jed Melentes, Principal, Two Trees Management, joining us live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, talking about the real estate market here in New York City and in our good friends over the river in Brooklyn. This is Bloomberg.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. Shares of engineering software maker Autodesk, they are rallying after activist investor Starboard takes a $500 million stake in the company. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle says there's more to this story.
They're also pushing for changes on the board. In fact, they are filing a lawsuit against the company to delay the annual shareholder meeting, saying that some accounting probe issues had been disclosed really at the last minute of when they could actually seek a change on the board. In return, we've had some comments from Autodesk recently saying Autodesk is, quote unquote, confident in the direction after the Starboard letter.
Autodesk shares are now up more than 4.5%. Broadcom is the latest company to be caught in the AI boom. It supplies chips to companies like Apple and surged 23% last week. Bloomberg's Katie Greifeld breaks down the numbers.
It's up 56% year to date through Friday's close. And as such as NVIDIA, Broadcom also planning a stock split, that 10-for-1 stock split. It becomes effective on July 15th. So it's going to be interesting to watch.
Broadcom up about 3%, and shares of Tesla, they're higher, up more than 3.5%. And this is after sources say the company may be testing self-driving software in China. Now, in other news, Electric reporting deliveries of Cybertrucks, well, they're being held up by a problem with the windshield wipers. Now, as far as earnings, we have homebuilder Lennar reporting after the close today. Their shares down about 1% right now. This is ahead of the report. And then looking further down the road, we'll hear from Kroger Thursday, CarMax on Friday. Shares of American Airlines, little change. The carrier and its flight attendants union, they're planning for another bargaining session tomorrow. The two sides said to be making progress. And stock in Monster Beverage, it's been falling over worries of slowing growth in U.S. energy drink sales. This morning, those shares are up about 1%. That's your company news at this hour. I'm Lisa Mateo.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Happy Monday, everybody. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the top news in business and finance and economics through our lens of our Bloomberg Intelligence analysts. They cover 2,000 companies in 130 industries worldwide. We also keep you updated on world and national news with Michael Barr. Michael?
Thank you very much, Alex. Paul, Lisa, a week and a half before the first presidential debate, former President Donald Trump meets today with the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, at Trump's resort in Mar-a-Lago. Congressional Republicans are looking at how to hold on to the slim majority they have in the House. Meanwhile, the ranks of the double haters, voters who say they do not like either major party presidential candidate, are at a historic high. According to a new analysis from Pew Research Center, it makes up a quarter of the electorate. Pangea policy founder Terry Haynes.
You know, Biden's got to show pretty much every day between now and November that he's up to the job and that he's kind of the saner, calmer alternative to Trump. That's the frame of the election to me, because then more people are likely to pull the lever for Biden, go the next yard if they get there. If they can't get there, then this election gets upended.
Pangea policy founder Terry Haynes. The biggest threat to Biden and Trump is that voters turned off by them will simply stay home or find refuge in an independent candidate. More than 81 million people are under alerts across the country as dangerous heat moves from coast to coast. It is forecast starting tomorrow in the Northeast and Midwest. It will bring at least 90-degree weather to New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Meanwhile, this Dallas resident was visiting Chicago over the weekend.
Definitely been hot, but it's not as hot, I would say, as Dallas, but it's a different hot. That wind coming off the water and everything is humid out here, so it's hot.
A heat wave is already driving up temperatures in many southern states over the weekend. Russian President Vladimir Putin will be visiting North Korea this week. It will be a two-day visit, according to North Korean state media. It's Putin's first trip to the country in 24 years. He's expected to meet with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un for talks on expanding military cooperation in the face of growing tensions with the U.S. Global news, 24 hours a day and whenever you want it, with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Paul, Alex, and now Charlie.
All right, thanks so much, Michael Barr. Here was a fascinating story from the Washington Post over the weekend, that voice assistants and AI chatbots cannot say who won the 2020 election. I found this totally fascinating. So Amazon's Alexa did not produce a reliably correct answer when it was asked who won the 2020 election. Alexa had replied on multiple occasions, Donald Trump is the front runner for the Republican nominee at 89.3%. Chatbots built by Microsoft and Google didn't answer the question at all, Paul. Apparently, Google's Gemini said, I'm still learning how to answer this question. In the meantime, try Google search.
Wow.
Wow.
Oh, my God. Isn't it? Well, I guess it's not self-evident, but for a lot of people out there. But, yeah, I mean, a lot of folks are relying more and more upon these voice assistants and AI chatbots, particularly the younger folks. And if you can't get accurate information, I guess, then that's a problem. So,
well, I mean, basically, you got to train these with large language models, right?
Right.
So where you're getting them, doesn't that then inform?
It does.
Whatever the result is, and if there's mass confusion and denials, then that is also going to inform those large language models. Now, this is obviously a very polarized issue. But what happens if it goes into other issues that are also equally polarized, right?
Well, I'm not sure why this is polarized. I mean, it seems like simple fact.
It feels like math. Yes.
It feels like
yes.
It feels like we've got somebody sitting in the White House who's been there for more than 3 years. I don't know. I thought that would kind of settle the issue, but I guess for some people it does not. And so therefore, this is reflected in these voice assistants.
And this also goes to just different biases, too, that some of the AI models have been accused of, right? They have to go back and they have to retrain, and this is part of the process. But anyway, that really struck me. I thought that was
this is
unreal.
An election year, is it not?
Oh,
boy. Okay.
So it feels like you kind of want to know. I don't know. We want to ask Alexa a question that's different than not knowing what the weather is. All right, coming up in the next hour, I'm going to give Paul a treat, and we're going to talk to the CEO of Weatherford. It is an oil services company, went from bankruptcy to awesomeness. We will discuss.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney.
The real outperformance has been the U.S. corporate high yield.
Are the companies lean enough? Have they trimmed all the fat?
The semiconductor business is a really cyclical business.
Breaking market headlines and corporate news from across the globe.
Do investors like the M&A that we've seen?
These are two big-time blue-chip companies.
The window between the peak and cut changing super fast.
Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up, we're going to get a little geeky on you, a little techie on you. Mark Burgon, technology reporter for Bloomberg News, join us from London. Google DeepMind shifts from research lab to AI product factory. It seems like everybody's trying to put all their resources behind AI, and Google is no different. We'll get the breakdown of that story. Plus, Girish Salagram, president and CEO at Weatherford, we'll discuss a recent company announcements and what's happening in the world of global energy. Corey Cantor, BNEF lead U.S. electric vehicle analyst, will give us the long-term outlook for electric vehicle, the forecast here. A lot of uncertainty as to the adoption of EVs around the world. We'll get the latest data from our good friends at BNEF. But right now, let's kick off this hour with Mr. Charlie Miller.
Very much, Paul Sweeney. Here's what's going on. We're looking at a mixed market. Back to work Monday now. Dow Industrials down 20, decline there of less than 0.1%. S&P up 4. That is a gain right now of just about 0.1%. The NASDAQ Composite Index higher by 17, up 0.1%. 10-year 4.28% with a 2-year at 4.74%. Spot gold down $8 the ounce to $23.24, down 0.4%. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.1%, back above 79 a barrel right now. 79.32 on WTI. So it is a mixed day. Stocks are wavering. Traders gearing up for economic data and a slew of Fed speakers this week for clues about the rate outlook. As for the timing of those potential rate cuts, Kelsey Barrow is Executive Director of Fixed Income at JP Morgan Investment Management.
Well, I think they can wait. They're in a strong position as it stands today, but we do think that ultimately by September, they'll be able to cut. So enjoy the summer and look forward to when you get back from summer vacation, the Fed should have enough data to cut in September.
Kelsey Barrow of JP Morgan Investment Management. A source tells Bloomberg Tesla has been granted approval to test its advanced driver assistance system in China on some Shanghai streets, the next step in rolling out the feature to Chinese drivers. Tesla shares up today by 4.5%. Again, recapping Mixed Monday. Dow, now little change, down less than 0.1%, down 4 points. S&P advancing by 0.1%, potentially could see another record today in the S&P. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, thank you so much, Charlie Pellet. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. Welcome to Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the top news and analysis from our Bloomberg analysts who cover 2,000 companies in 130 industries worldwide. We also keep you updated on everything you need to know within the market. And for that, we go to Abigail Doolittle, markets reporter for Bloomberg TV. Abigail, you know, Scott Rebner over at Goldman Sachs, I was chatting with him today on IB, and he was like, look, Friday is a big deal. We have a liquidity event Friday. We have quadruple witching, lots of options expire, S&P 500 rebalancing, ETF rebalancing. What are you looking ahead to?
That's interesting. I have not been thinking that far forward, and sometimes that can turn out to be a big deal, and other times it's a little bit of a dud. One thing that we know is that it leads to a ton of volume, as you know, so many securities change hands or expire. It can also lead to volatility. In terms of the folks that I talk to in options world, I have not heard too much of a look ahead toward that. And when I take a look at the VIX right now, you know, it has a 12 handle, closer to 13, but it has a 12 handle. Correlations and dispersion are relatively low as well, suggesting that investors are looking past all sorts of uncertainty relative to the Fed. But something that's been coming up for me a lot recently in some of my conversations with folks in the world of real estate, which is another one of my beats, is the election, that we have this upcoming election and that it could really produce a great deal of uncertainty. And they are starting to see some people sit on the sidelines. And when you fold this into with Goldman Sachs raising their price target in the S&P 500 to 5,600, Evercore ISI to 6,000, those are case scenarios where it assumes everything goes well. And that may happen, but there are so many factors out there to create some uncertainty. But for some reason, it's not really showing up in stocks.
Yeah, I mean, boy, 6,000 on SPX, that would be something. We had 40,000 recently on the Dow, so why not? Broadcom, another all-time high today. Do we just buy the chips across the board?
You know, I think you could almost buy anything that they say that they're doing something with AI.
right.
And, you know, at some point we're going to learn the truth around AI. I wonder if it's going to be, I think, based on everything that I know, and I admittedly am not an expert on AI and the technology, but based on stocks, companies, trends, and relating it to the past, the internet clearly changed everything for all of us. And then there was a big crash, and it sort of the quality got shaken out. A couple years ago, I did a number of panels on Bitcoin and the blockchain. All of those guests would say, Bitcoin might go away, but blockchain is hugely valuable. Well, where's the blockchain? I think that AI is probably somewhere in between. So I think that there is probably going to be a little bit of a shakeout, but until that happens, that shakeout will probably happen when NVIDIA for the first time, and it will happen at some point, we just don't know when they don't put up a banner quarter and a massive, massive raise. Is that in a quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters, a year, 3 years? We don't know how long this is going to last. But yeah, puts, you know, AI on it. You know, Paul, you mentioned Dow 40,000. That's something I've been really taking a look at, because the Dow went above 40,000, I think only on an intraday basis. And so you have the Dow down, you have the Russell 2000 down, basically a value underperforming growth. Everybody, or a lot of people have been expecting that narrative to shift at some point, but it's been the story for years and years, even a couple of decades. I think that that's worth noting. Divergences are always worth noting.
Apple.
Yeah,
on
Apple, my gosh.
Tear. I mean, it has been quite a move. What's the upside? What are you looking at when you look at the chart?
So Apple's been very surprising to me. It's broken out of the range between, let's call it 165 and 200. I would argue we still don't know whether or not that's a false initial reaction, which can happen technically where the investors just take it the wrong way. When I first saw this breakout, the 2 days of last week at one point up 14% in 2 days, the best since 2008. So when you think about that kind of buying on those dips from 2008, that's what we were seeing. It seemed to me like folks were using it as a trading vehicle. The idea that you could do that with the world's second largest or largest or third largest, depending on the day, company is kind of amazing, especially given the fact that the stock had been merely in a bear market from December to April. Some of that Berkshire selling, but some of my sources are also saying it was used as a funding short, so people are basically using that money to go in other big tech. I don't know. Yeah, if it takes out 220, then we could see Apple go significantly higher. Valuation is stretched, and numbers growth-wise, unless something amazing happens with the new iPhone, we're looking at single digits for this year, next year.
On that front, I think I'm going to be buying the new iPhone.
I've heard a lot of people saying that, and I was talking to somebody over, Alon Rosen over at Oppenheimer. He says that the talk on Apple and the iPhone is that this upgrade cycle is going to be real, that a lot of people are going to be doing it. So that if that is the talk and it actually happens, yeah, maybe we do see Apple break out.
I got the iPhone 11.
No, you have to. This is not up for debate.
Yeah, this is not for debate.
Oh, you have an old. So
11.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
like the
you're
battery's
definitely
starting to
getting
go.
it.
So, but I'm gonna. So Anurag Rana is like my personal iPhone shopper. He tells me to buy it, the new one that comes out in September. So we'll do
Yeah,
that.
you just gotta make it to September. I'm not entirely convinced your phone's gonna make it till
I'm
then.
out there with the charger on the beach and everything. Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much for joining us. Abigail Doolittle, she covers all the markets for us. We were just talking about AI. Let's segue, as Tom Keene would say, right to some more AI discussion. Mark Burgon, he is a technology reporter for Bloomberg News, joining us from Zoom from London, which is a technology hub, we all know. Mark, thanks so much for joining us here. Google, AI, what's their strategy?
Thanks for having me. I think, the good way to put their strategy in some ways is they're trying to no longer be in their back foot, right? I think that with the past 2 years, and our story this morning looks at how Google and DeepMind really set the infrastructure and then the base layer for this sort of AI boom that we've had, and then ChatGPT kind of took all the glory in some ways. And so they're playing catch up in, you'd say, not necessarily on the technical side, but there's certainly now, ChatGPT and all its iterations from the different companies building language models like Anthropic and Cohere, they're all sort of threatening Google's search in a way that really hasn't happened in almost 2 decades. And so their strategy is, I would say, defensive at this point.
How does it get on the offense? What does it need to do to sort of change that narrative?
Yeah, I think, the story we looked at today was a lot about this mergers that Google put in place a year ago. So they've had, out here in London is DeepMind, which is widely considered like the world's leading AI lab, and has for the past decade effectively been the best funded university running in the world, right? They've basically been a research lab. They put out some great breakthroughs like AlphaGo, AlphaFold around protein folding, but they haven't been deeply integrated and connected with kind of Google's commercial and profit center. Google Brain, which was the competing AI lab that they also had in California, that was a little bit more tied to a lot of the popular Google services. And they've been all merged that for the past year under Demis Hassabis here, who runs all of Google AI. It's had kind of a bumpy road so far, but I think their plan is to continue to ship things like Gemini, their big foundational model, tweak that and start be kind of integrating a lot of this research directly into commercial services.
Mark, what does Google say about that ChatGPT and just as a fundamental threat to the core Google search business? How do they respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, Google publicly is great about never talking about their rivals by name. I've said anyways they say nothing. I mean, I think that's something they've talked about for a long time, is that sort of their token phrase that Sundar Pichai uses, is that search is the last kind of biggest moonshot for Google. I think they're thinking a lot about what that search interface looks like, how they're going to adapt to if consumers move to things like ChatGPT, and Gemini. What does that mean for, say, Google's search ads business, which is still the lion's share of its revenue? They've had some clear mishaps, some pretty ugly snafus, and since the launch of Gemini this year, right? Like there was that kind of famous incident where they were some of the responses were encouraging people to put glue on pizza, right? There were these. They've described this as sort of like this is kind of early stage in this technology and some stumbles that they've had, but they are the world's leaders in search, and this is something where they have a lot of deep responsibility to get this right, not just for their business, but for people's trust in using Google.
Well, that's what's so difficult, right? It's like all the technology is changing so fast, but you still need to do it. So it's you're like, we're watching it in real time. Paul and I were just talking about a Washington Post article that was on the weekend that talked about how all the AI models cannot answer who won the presidential election in the U.S. in 2020. And I'm just wondering, how these advanced technologies solve for problems. If they're using these large language models, which is basically like, me and Paul talking or regular people talking, does that also mess them up?
Yeah, I think, it reminds me a little bit of, it's a slightly different technology, obviously, but, there in 2016, Google had this big mess where if there was a popular, or there was a blog, or this kind of fringe blog that said that, if I remember this correctly, it's been a long time, but it was that Hillary Clinton won the election in 2016, right? And that was at the top of, for briefly and momentarily, at the top of Google News results. And they've dealt with this sort of problem around misinformation, around totally not credible sources being at the top of Google search. You're seeing problems they're now dealing with. I saw a story today about Google Images and like consensual porn. I mean, these problems I think are being multiplied because with these tools that generative AI do, which Google talks a lot about as being revolutionary, it also just makes content production so much easier. And so there's just this multitude of content now, and Google has been this sort of their primary service is to organize this, and that has a lot of messy problems, especially when OpenAI has kind of forced, and Microsoft has forced Google is to move a lot faster than they have been in years past, and we've seen some clear stumbles from that.
So, Mark, does Google feel like they can just solve this problem or make up ground simply by spending more? Because certainly they have plenty of cash to spend.
I think that's right. I think, I would say they have the CapEx to be able to do that. I mean, so does Microsoft. I think, Google's logic here is twofold, right? They clearly have a lot of engineering talent and a lot of experience on this, right? Like they're like I said earlier, that they had to launch this paper. They wrote this paper that launched this entire generative AI boom. They have decades of experience of actually like doing cutting edge AI. And I think they also have proprietary data that a lot of companies don't have, right? Like they have not just the main services, Google Maps, YouTube, search, Gmail, right? Just like that corpus of data they have that's able to sort of train AI services. That's something that really no other company has. I think the question has always been for them, can they translate that into something like for their cloud business, right, where they're in third place now? Does that data set advantages, does that translate into commercial sales? Not necessarily clear, but I think that's sort of what they always point to is we have the talent and we have this infrastructure in place that's been there for decades.
Well, it's a really good piece. You guys should all check it out. It was in Bloomberg Business Week today. What are you working on next now?
Well, it's summer here in Europe, so nothing. I'm just kidding.
Don't let the bosses hear you say that.
I'll tease a story for tomorrow. I think there's, one thing that we mentioned briefly in this story. There's, I think it's really interesting is a lot of applications in AI are moving not just from kind of generating images and text and chatbots, but into the material sciences. That's something that DeepMind is working on a lot. I think there's a tension we talk about in the story today between, whether or not the company should be, how much time it allocates to working on Gemini and competing with OpenAI versus working on something that would kind of push the envelope and work in the biology or pharmaceutical industry. And DeepMind and Google shifted more research towards the sort of OpenAI competition. I think that's created this wave for a lot of new companies moving into, say, biology and chemistry and applying AI to the lab. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I think we saw that in cancer research too. Like you're basically going to be co-pilots. So you still need doctors, you still need all the researchers, but they can be co-pilots. And that idea of thinking about that was quite interesting. Hey, Mark, really appreciate it. Look forward to tomorrow's article as well. Mark Bergen, a Bloomberg technology reporter joining us from the UK. I don't know. I still don't get it.
I mean, just ask a person what practical application of AI, and I don't get a nice, consistent.
It's just, that's a cool thing about it all developing at once, but it doesn't make it easier for people like laymen's like us to understand.
You just roll back 3, 4, 5 years ago, I think this was big data. We called it big data. And to me, this is just the next iteration of making smarter analysis of all the data, structured data and unstructured data. You think the internet, all that unstructured data, chats, all those types of emails, all that kind of stuff. And what is that data? How can you use that data to become more efficient? I don't know. That's a long way of answering. If you can't do it in like 20 words or less, you don't understand it.
Right.
And I'm in that camp right now.
Well, coming up.
But I own NVIDIA. I own.
Right. Exactly. Because, you know, it's also called momentum. There's that too.
Boy.
Coming up, I have a treat for Paul. We have the CEO and president of Weatherford. It's an oil services company. The stock is up almost 90% within the last year. A huge move. We're going to talk about how it got out of bankruptcy from 2019.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:20 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Big turnaround for the U.S. stock market, solidly in the green right now for the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ 100 index as well. Russell 2000, though, does remain lower. We've got the Russell 2000 down by 0.5%, but the S&P up 11 to 54.42, gain right now of 0.2%. The Dow up 47, up 0.1%. NASDAQ up 32, for NASDAQ a gain of 0.2%. 10-year yield 4.28%. The 2-year 4.75%. Spot gold down $11 the ounce, a drop there of 0.5%. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg and Acting Labor Secretary Julie Su have been meeting with American Airlines and its flight attendants. They will meet again for contract talks tomorrow after making some progress toward an agreement that would avert a walkout in the summer travel season. Shares of American Airlines, they are unchanged right now. Again, recapping, a rally underway for the U.S. stock market. West Texas Intermediate crude oil back above $79 a barrel, $79.55 right now, up 1.4%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, thanks so much, Charlie Pellet. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the top news in business and finance through our lens of our Bloomberg Intelligence analysts. They cover 2,000 companies and 130 industries worldwide. I also get to bring in some of my oil CEOs, and I get to, I'll explain to Paul, like oil stuff, which I always appreciate. And joining us in studio, I have a very special guest for us. It's President and CEO of Weatherford, Girish Saligram. Weatherford is an oil services company. It does international, it does domestic, it does onshore, it does offshore. It also has a leg in the energy transition. What makes this company unique is that it went bankrupt in 2019. Girish took over in 2020, and the stock has crushed. This year, it's up by over the last year, it's up 90%. It's beaten all of its peers. It's beaten the oil services index. And even one analyst over at Citi said that the turnaround at Weatherford post-pandemic has been nothing short of remarkable. And these analysts don't hand out that kind of compliment very often. Girish, it's so good to see you. Thank you for stopping by.
Alex, great to see you again. And Paul, is great to meet you. Thank you so much for having me.
So how's it going? It's been quite a 4 years for you.
Mm-hmm.
You came in the bankruptcy, you had to turn it around. Where are you in this turnaround? What more do you think you still have to go, et cetera?
No, great question. Look, it's been a terrific 4 years. The team's done an incredible job. I think very few people could have dreamt where we would be today and what was possible. The way I think about it is the turnaround's mostly done. We've gotten the company out of the ditch. We have stabilized everything. We have fixed the balance sheet. So the journey so far has been from broken to good. The next phase of the journey is really the good to great journey, and that's what I'm actually very excited about, because if we've been able to do all of the things that we've done over the past 4 years with a lot of constraints, a lot of shackles, the exciting part is what we can do without that.
So when you go from good to great, does that mean like a lot of buybacks and dividends? Does that mean, what is that?
Look, it's a lot of different things, but ultimately it is creation of value. And it's creation of value for our customers, for our employees, and most of all for our shareholders. But it's doing that with continued focus on greater cash generation, which comes from better margins, better improvement in the way we manage our net working capital, but also ultimately better investment. So our real goal is to make sure that we've got world-class return on invested capital.
Now that I see, as an outsider to the energy industry, I see a lot of M&A activity there. And being a former banker myself, that's what hits my radar screen. How do you guys think about M&A for your business now that you are on maybe firmer footing?
Correct. For the first 3 years, M&A was a bad word. Weatherford actually built up on a series of acquisitions and a lot of issues with that, especially around the lack of integration. So the first 3 years that I've been in the role, we really focused on the organic capabilities of the company, building out the portfolio, making sure we fix the operating intensity and the rigor around the company. But we have now gotten to a point where M&A has become a very important salient topic. We actually just exercised that muscle for the first time. We announced 3 small acquisitions back in February. So 2 in the wireline technology space, 1 in a very exciting space in intervention, which really gives us capability in slot recovery and plug-in abandonment, which is a very key part of that energy transition. So we have started to do that, and I think there will be more to come because we've now got a balance sheet that allows us to do that, and more importantly, a team that understands the importance of integration and is learning how to build that into the operating cadence of the company.
And just to give our listeners a sense, your services are the life cycle. How do your services differ than, say, one of your competitors? And how do you sort of invest for the life cycle of a well for a customer?
Sure. So in oilfield services, there's a lot of companies that do a lot of things similarly. So we've got what differentiates us, we've got a portfolio that provides core OFS services. So everything from drilling services to wireline, et cetera. But we're also able to complement that with what we call specialty services. Things like managed pressure drilling, tubular running services, intervention services, etc., that very few, if anyone, has. So that combination of broad-based services that allow us to go toe-to-toe with the larger peers in the sector, as well as then these specialty products and specialty services give us that differentiation and also allow us to have higher margins.
You know, I keep joking to Alex, with oil at $80 a barrel, I'm going to drive down to Texas and start drilling some holes. I mean, isn't the cost like $40 and $80? I can make some money there, but I don't see a whole lot of drilling activity. What's going to take it for the industry to take advantage of these prices here?
Look, I think the industry has really embraced this concept of delivering returns for shareholders. And so I think there's a lot of discipline, especially around managing capital within the industry. That's further exacerbated by the wave of M&A that's happening, which again goes back to driving higher returns. So I don't think in the U.S. there's going to be necessarily a sea change, at the range of oil prices that we are seeing right now, which I think in the longer term is actually good for our sector especially. It creates a balance versus the seesaw effect that you see in the cyclicality that we've seen in the past. We also have a very robust international market. So for Weatherford, less than 20% of our revenues come from North America. The bulk of it is really an international orientation, international leverage. So, we see a very healthy market. Now, the U.S. is still the largest market in the world. We see a lot of activity, but it is something that is driven by capital discipline by our customers, which is a good thing.
And when we have M&A too, does that eventually lead into less business for oil services companies? Because in theory, maybe an Exxon Pioneer going to drill 10 wells rather than 20.
Yeah, I think, look, we are seeing a lot of drilling efficiencies. We are seeing the rig count go down. But I think it all comes down to differentiation. As long as companies can differentiate and deliver value to allow our customers to make greater headway on their efficiencies to generate higher returns, I think there'll always be business. Again, it is the largest market still.
I mean, I'm looking at your income statement. I mean, roughly half your revenue, Eastern Hemisphere, half Western Hemisphere. Give us the economics of both of those, your domestic markets versus your international markets.
Yeah, historically, North America was a very profitably challenged market for us on a profitability basis.
That's a nice way of saying that.
Right. So our team's done a fabulous job over the past few years, really changing the way we run the North America business. So today, the profitability across all of our geographies, all of our regions, is pretty much in balance. So, and I think, I've always said the litmus test of our turnaround has been what's happened in the North America market. Over the past year, we've seen revenues decline in North America, but the profitability has actually gone up. So that's a real testament to what we've been able to do at Weatherford and the operating rigor, the operating intensity that the team has put in.
What are you doing on the energy transition space? Where do you play in that?
Yeah, so first of all, Alex, for us, it starts with this whole space of plug-in abandonment. We think that's going to be...
What does that actually mean?
Yeah, so what that is the responsible decommissioning of mature oil and gas wells. So as oil and gas fields stop producing, customers want to make sure that those wells are plugged properly so that you don't have any risk of leaks from them and you don't have any environmental damage. So we play a big role in that, and we've bolstered our portfolio with the acquisition that I just talked about earlier this year. So that's a huge space, and we think that'll be something that'll play out over several years. So, that's number one. The second element for us is geothermal energy. We've been a leader in geothermal for over 2 decades, mostly driven by our capability in high temperature tools. We've had a capability leading to very high differentiation in high temperature, which, as you can imagine, is important in geothermal. But we're now extending that beyond just drilling. So multiple aspects of the geothermal loop. We've got partnerships with organizations like Serafi, with Ever, which is a Canadian company doing some very novel work in geothermal. As geothermal shifts from this whole notion of you've got to be somewhere near a volcanic region to now in multiple parts of the world, in cities as well. I was in Hamburg about a year ago, where they're drilling wells in the middle of the city itself, providing district heating, etc. So geothermal's a big platform for us. The next one is CCUS. Now, CCUS is a huge ecosystem.
Carbon capture, utilization, and storage.
Nice.
Yeah.
It's a huge ecosystem. We don't play in a lot of it, but where we do play is in the storage and monitoring aspect of it. So again, this is where our technological capabilities lend themselves more directly. So that's a huge space for us. Sort of leading to that or away from that, but somewhat tied, is whole emissions management and emissions monitoring. We recently just announced a agreement, an MOU that we signed with Honeywell in this whole methane emissions management, which brings Honeywell's state-of-the-art technological capability, especially around sensing, our access to our customers' oil fields. We are also the only OFS player to have its own SCADA system, a data acquisition system, built on top of our production optimization platform. So that's an area that I'm very excited about. And last but not least, solutions mining. So that's a big area for us.
Garish, we really appreciate it. Thank you so much for stopping by. It's so good to get your perspective, and it's good to start getting chatting again and all the opportunities there. And like I said, Weatherford really outperforming all of its peers in the last year. Garish Salagram, President and CEO of Weatherford International. Weatherford International? Just Weatherford.
Weatherford International.
Yeah, we say international. All right, here's Michael Barr with World and National News. Michael?
Thank you very much, Alex. Paul, Charlie. Israeli officials say Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has dissolved the influential war cabinet that was tasked with steering the war in Gaza. The cabinet was dissolved following the departure of opposition lawmaker Benny Gantz, who had joined the coalition in the early days of the war. It comes as Israel says it is opening up the Kerem Shalom crossing. Today's briefing comes a day after the Israeli military announced the tactical pause in the area of southern Gaza to allow the deliveries of humanitarian aid. Coordinator of Government Activities, spokesperson Shimon Friedman.
We're opening this route for them where they can move without needing to coordinate every time, and where there will be military presence along the way.
Friedman says the route would increase the flow of aid to other parts of Gaza as well. Maryland Governor Wes Moore today is issuing more than 175,000 pardons for low-level marijuana convictions. Moore says the state owes it to those convicted for behavior that isn't illegal anymore.
Rolling out one of the best and most equitable legal markets in the country is incredibly important. But that rollout must go hand in hand with pardoning past conduct, and Maryland is going to lead by example.
Maryland legalized recreational cannabis last year. New York and the rest of the U.S. Northeast are about to get a record-breaking heat wave that will boost electricity demand, raising health risks, and potentially be a headache for commuters. Manhattan Central Park is set to reach at least 95 degrees by Friday. Forecasters say the worst of the heat will spread through the Midwest, upstate New York, and New England this week before descending on New York City and Washington. New York City Mayor Eric Adams says a heat advisory will likely be posted later this week. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ holding in the green right now. Treasury yields are climbing in the run-up to retail sales numbers. Right now we have got the S&P advancing by 8 points, overcoming earlier losses, now at 54.40. Could see a record today on the S&P, up now by about 0.2%. The Dow higher by 5, just about flat on the day, while NASDAQ, the composite index, up 28, up 0.2%. The NASDAQ 100 index up by 0.4%. 10-year yield 4.29%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.75%. Gold down 0.9%, 23.11 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude up 1%, 79.23 a barrel. As for the inflation outlook and the Federal Reserve, Christina Hooper is Chief Global Market Strategist at Invesco.
We're doing everything that historically has resulted in a reduction in inflation. So I think that's going to happen this time around. But there will be certainly data points that disappoint. But when we take a step back and look at the trend, I think we'll get to a place where the Fed is able to cut probably 2 times this year.
Christina Hooper of Invesco. UBS says it will give investors in Credit Suisse funds linked to the collapse of Greensill Capital a significant proportion of their money back as the Swiss bank looks to clear through the legacy issues of its former rival. UBS shares, they're up by 1.7%. Again, recapping, stocks higher, S&P advancing 8 points now, up 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, thank you so much, Charlie Pellet. Alex Steele here with Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the news in business and economics through our lens of our Bloomberg Intelligence analysts. We also, every Monday at this time, tap Bloomberg NEF. Their research covers commodities, power, transport, industry, buildings, ag sectors, technology, anything that we need to know as we kind of transition our energy and security and energy transition throughout the world. And I should point out that every time they release their EV global outlook, it is the thing that is quoted by Wall Street analysts. You go to Wall Street analysts and they're using BNEF's data from EVs to model their own opinion. So we wanted to dig a little deeper. The report was released last week. Corey Cantor is BNEF lead U.S. electric vehicle analyst. Corey, thank you for joining. What was your overall takeaway? Like, okay, EV growth will be X. And then what was it for the U.S.?
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Alex. Great to be back here with you and Paul. I think the big takeaway is that EV sales growth is happening unevenly across different regions in the world. Maybe not a surprising finding if you're following EVs on a day-to-day basis, but moving forward, we expect that to be a bit of the same. To give you a sense of where we see things going, we basically have both a near-term outlook and a long-term outlook. The near-term outlook ends in 2027, and so what we expect is by 2027, global passenger EV sales will be about 30 million in our base case called the economic transition scenario. And a probably better metric of that is thinking about EV share of passenger vehicle sale. So we'll move from a world where 1 in 5 cars sold is electric to a world where 1 in 3 is, about 33%, up from 18% last year. By 2040, we expect that about 73% of all new car sales will be electric, but there's a long way to go. And then on the U.S. question, always good to compare it, I think, to China and Europe. U.S. passenger EV share of sale last year was around 10%. We expect the next 2 years to see a bit of a slower growth, so only about 12% of new car sales should be electric this year, rising to about 29% by 2027. Seems pretty good, but if you look at Europe and China, it's going to be much higher there. So by 2027, we expect about 60% of new car sales to be electric in China and 41% in Europe. And when we talk about passenger EVs at BNEF, that's both battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles.
So talk to us about those plug-in hybrids. It feels like a lot of folks are suggesting that might be a very viable interim step, for, at least in the U.S., in terms of the transition to EV. Is that how you think about it?
Paul, really good question. I also co-wrote the plug-in hybrid section of the report. We do a kind of deep dive, which we do a few different deep dives every year in what we call thematic highlights. I think around PHEVs, the question really is...
PHEVs?
Yeah, PHEV.
Plug-in hybrids, okay.
Plug-in hybrids,
okay.
Is how good are they going to be? If you look at the plug-in hybrids in China, they're all electric mode, meaning their kind of electric mileage they get before they have to turn on that gas engine is about twice as high in China currently as it is in the US. So quite simply, China is making not only better fully electric vehicles, but better plug-in hybrids. We still think that there is some role for PHEVs to play this decade in markets like the US, in Japan. But what I've been big on pushing on is the product that we're getting today is not necessarily as good as it should be. So when you hear automakers say, oh, well, maybe we'll do more hybrids or do more plug-in hybrids instead of fully electric vehicles, I think a fair response would be to say, well, in Europe and China, they're getting far more all-electric mileage than here. So can you deliver some of that more high-quality product? Ultimately, we do a bunch of different scenario analysis in the full report. And one downside of plug-in hybrids is that if you go down that route and people aren't charging them enough, which is harder to do because of the lower all-electric range, you could end up in a scenario where you're having a lot higher oil demand use than if you just switch to fully electric vehicles, and that would not be good for your climate targets.
When do you think the tipping point is when EVs become more of mass adoption here in the U.S.?
So what we've pointed out historically is this idea of upfront price parity. We're seeing total cost of ownership parity, including fueling, already being hit in many different regions. In terms of upfront costs, it really depends if you're comparing apples to apples, right? You see a lot more EVs in that kind of low $40,000 price range now, high 30s. I think once you get to the low $30,000 price point, really, according to our analysis, when you're looking at kind of a generic BEV versus a generic ICE vehicle, we see it happening in the U.S. over, let's say, the next 3 to 4 years, really 2026 to 2028. But really, if you're comparing a Tesla Model Y towards a lot of its competitor vehicles or a Model 3, you're getting pretty close. But that's where you start to see, I think, higher adoption, where you won't have to necessarily have a premium in price. You also get a lot of good leasing deals today on EVs, but it's a bit messier to kind of figure that out because you've got dealer markups, you've got different rates. But big picture, that upfront price parity.
How about the charging infrastructure in the United States? To what extent has that been holding back the adoption of EVs here, and kind of how do we expect that to evolve?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest difference between Europe and China. Our EV outlook, for folks who aren't familiar, has whole sections on charging infrastructure, how much investment is going to be needed moving forward. But really just taking a base level stat, Tesla remains the #1 provider of charging infrastructure here in the U.S. in terms of reliability, in terms of number of fast charging stations. And then there isn't really a clear-cut number 2, 3, 4, 5. My colleague Ryan Fisher does a bunch of great presentations on this, and one of the most impressive findings is U.S. and Europe actually have a similar amount of chargers between the top 6 kind of charging infrastructure operators, but Europe has an additional 500 operators after that really supply the bulk of the market. So again, we want to see more of that infrastructure built out. There's been a lot of reporting around the federal funds rolling out really slowly because they've had to go through state RFPs. But yeah, that's the #1 issue holding back probably the U.S. market, maybe even moving past the upfront cost issue.
Oh, we only have about a minute left, but at least with my ICE car, right, I can trade it in, and I can get value for it. Do we know how this market evolves for EVs?
Yeah, I mean, I did a residual value note with the team at BNEF maybe about 2 years ago, and the market looked so different then. That's when Tesla prices were going 10 to 15% above their kind of selling price. And so now you've seen, because Tesla brought its prices down, that residuals for a lot of EVs have crashed. I think it's going to be something that continues to develop. We need to find out how long batteries are going to last.
Right, do we know that yet?
It varies. I mean, we don't have, I think, any research here where we've said that this is what we find amongst all the kind of EVs in the market. But right, if your battery holds up longer than people expect, you'd expect to see maybe more residual value. If not, you could see more of an issue. But yeah, it's an outstanding question, like so much of the space. But to your point, Alex, that's why you want to see more, look into battery life over time.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's going to be really interesting. All right, Corey, thanks a lot. We really appreciate it. Corey Cantor, BNEF lead U.S. electric vehicle analyst, joining us on their new report. Definitely check it out. It's what all the street winds up quoting as we sort of go through this energy transition with the questions that we all have. I don't know, how long have you had your phone? I'm comparing battery life.
I got 5 years maybe?
5 years? Okay, so let's just say 5 years. Yep. I'm assuming a car battery is going to be a lot better than your phone battery?
I hope so.
I don't know.
I don't know.
But I don't know if you're forced to re-up your car because of the battery. I don't know. That feels different. That feels different than I just got to replace my brakes. I don't know.
Walk into the Apple store.
Maybe I'm wrong. Yeah, exactly. All right, this is Bloomberg Intelligence. Happy Monday, everybody.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. The Food and Drug Administration has delayed a breast and lung cancer trial of an experimental treatment that BioNTech licensed from Chinese biotech Metalink Therapeutics, citing safety concerns. BioNTech said Metalink stopped enrolling U.S. patients in the study, which had aimed to recruit 80 volunteers to test a new antibody drug conjugate, a type of medicine that is designed to deliver targeted therapy to a tumor. BioNTech shares trading lower right now. We've got BioNTech down by 4.23%. Activist investor Starboard Value says it has built a stake in Autodesk valued at more than $500 million and does plan to push for changes to the board. Autodesk shares, they're climbing now by 5.6%. A source tells Bloomberg Tesla has been granted approval to test its advanced driver assistance system on some Shanghai streets, the next step in rolling out the feature to Chinese drivers. The city of Hangzhou in eastern China's Zhejiang province may also issue approval of the U.S. electric car maker to test the system. Tesla shares, they're surging today. We've got Tesla up by just about 4.4%. American Airlines and its flight attendants will be meeting for contract talks tomorrow after making some progress toward an agreement that would avert a walkout in the summer travel season. Shares of American Airlines today, they are trading right now. We do have American down by 0.3%. Among other airlines, JetBlue up 0.7, and Boeing, meanwhile, the playmaker, up by 0.8%. Those are our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pellet, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Happy Monday, everybody. I'm Alex Steele with Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We are broadcasting to you live from the Interactive Broker Studio right here in the Midtown Manhattan, which I think isn't really hot yet. I think it's still nice out.
Yeah, it's
so
still
I think
nice
we're in
out
an okay
today,
place. We bring you world and national news for that. We go to Michael Barr. Michael?
Thank you very much, Alex, Paul, Charlie. Israeli officials said today that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has dissolved the influential war cabinet that was tasked with steering the war in Gaza. The war cabinet was dissolved following the departure of opposition lawmaker Benny Gantz. Meanwhile, the Israeli military says it is pausing fighting during daytime hours along a route in southern Gaza to free up a backlog of humanitarian aid deliveries for Palestinians. It should allow aid trucks to reach the Israel-controlled Kerem Shalom crossing. IDF spokesman Daniel Hagari blames Hamas for the reduced flow, accusing them of looting.
How do we distribute the food without Hamas in the game, taking the food, looting the food, using the food for his military operatives?
The United Nations says it welcomes the move. New York's first heat wave of the season is expected to start tomorrow. Mayor Eric Adams says the city is ready.
Cooling centers will be open starting tomorrow, and we expect to hit peak heat on Thursday and Friday, with the heat index possibly reaching 99 degrees.
Adams says the National Weather Service is expected to issue a heat advisory through Friday with high heat and humidity. Maryland Governor Wes Moore is issuing more than 175,000 pardons for marijuana convictions. Moore today says the pardons forgive low-level marijuana possession charges.
We cannot celebrate the benefits of legalization if we do not address the consequences of criminalization.
Maryland legalized recreational pot last year. The U.S. Surgeon General today called for adding a formal warning label on social media sites like those placed on cigarette cartons. In an op-ed piece in the New York Times, Dr. Vivek Murthy says warning parents that TikTok, Instagram, and other platforms can harm kids' mental health. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Paul, Alex, Charlie.
All righty, let's get to, thank you, Michael Barr. Thank you very much. But let's get more of that heat because, man, that's going to be crazy. So Central Park is going to hit 98 degrees Fahrenheit by Friday. And it's not just the U.S. Lots of other parts of the Northeast are going to get record-breaking heat waves. And, you know, Paul, I was making a big deal about it, and Paul's like, It's just heat. We go through this every summer, but this feels early.
Early, you're right. Yeah, exactly. It's a little early for that. And here, just for the folks in New York City, I really feel it when you go onto the subway platform. That's where it just gets out of control. And even after the heat wave breaks, it takes 2 or 3 days for it to cool down.
Yes.
And it'll take 2 or 3 days for it to heat up. It won't be, Thursday won't be too bad, but by the weekend.
And by Monday. New York Governor Kathy Hochul said that it can warp railroad tracks. I had no idea, which makes sense. And slow down commutes in some of the large eastern cities that we take to work and rely on to move people. I mean, the grid definitely is used to this when it comes to, summer heat waves and stuff, but it always does feel like a test. Like, can we handle it? It's sort of like when we had, record low temperatures Christmas about 2 years ago. Can the grid handle it? It's these sort of questions that we constantly consider. At least I do.
Like for me, summer starts Memorial Day weekend. But officially, for the calendar, it's not till Thursday.
Right.
So this is going to be, I guess, from that perspective, perfect timing. The first day of summer. Let's get some blasting heat here in the Northeast. But our good friends in the Midwest have already been dealing with this heat as well. So it's just kind of making its way across the country. And there's even some wildfires I saw in the LA area. I got 2 of my offspring there, so they were talking about that. So again, just kind of I guess another summer of some, I'm not gonna say extreme heat, but just, I guess with the new normal.
And this is when Paul Sweeney says, it's all right.
It's all right.
I go to the shore. I go to the bar at the shore, but then at 50.
Exactly.
It's all fine.
All good.
That wraps it up for Paul and me on this Monday, Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We will have you covered throughout the week, particularly on that heat wave. You got Treasury sliding here today. You got stocks pretty much doing nothing. Looking forward to retail sales. Balance of Power with Joe Matthew up next.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Just 1 month to the Republican convention. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as the presidential race enters a critical phase this week. With the first debate, the sentencing of Donald Trump ahead, and the convention all in the next 4 weeks, we're going to walk the political landscape with the country's top pollster coming up next. Don Levy of Siena College Research Institute is with us here on the fastest show in politics. Israel's military, meantime, announcing a strategic pause. And the White House says it's prepared to tap the Strategic Petroleum Reserve if necessary this summer. We'll hit all these stories with our signature panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis are with us for the duration. And we start, as always, on Wall Street. Right now, the markets with Charlie Pellet in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthew. Back to work Monday. Stocks higher for now. Little changed on the Dow, up just 12 points. We've got the S&P climbing 10, a gain there of 0.2%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index up 31, up by about 0.2%. The 10-year yield 4.28%, 2-year 4.75%. Gold is now slumping $18 the ounce to $23.14, down by about 0.8%. And West Texas Intermediate crude 79.39 a barrel right now, up by 1.2%. Traders are gearing up for key economic data and a slew of Federal Reserve speakers for clues about the interest rate outlook. As for the election, politics, and U.S. markets, Stephen Major is global head of fixed income research at HSBC Bank Middle East Limited.
All of us should just recognize whoever's the president in 2025 is going to have double the debt stock of 8 years ago. So whoever's there is going to be somehow restricted in what can be done in terms of future fiscal loosening.
Stephen Major of HSBC. We're keeping an eye on shares of Autodesk. Activist investor Starboard Value says it has built a stake in Autodesk valued at more than $500 million and plans to push for changes. Autodesk now up by 5.4%. Recapping, S&P up 10, 54.41, now up 0.2%. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Hope you had a great Father's Day. Welcome to Monday, the Monday edition of Balance of Power. We're live from Washington. I am Joe Matthew, and it's great to have you here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. Interesting week for politics. The House is out. Senate's got a light schedule this week. We've got Juneteenth right in the middle of it. And it's an opportunity to look beyond the bubble here, which we're going to be doing over the course of the next couple of hours, not only to the campaign after a really interesting weekend with Donald Trump doing his rally in Michigan, Detroit, trying to appeal to black voters, President Biden on a stage with Jimmy Kimmel and Barack Obama raising gobs of money. And we're going to talk about the contours in the campaign 1 month out from the Republican convention with Don Levy from Siena. He'll be with us in a few, but we have important news as well in the Middle East that we want to cover with Dan Flatley from our national security team here. Important headlines as Israel pauses military action, pauses combat on an important road in Gaza to allow for more aid. This is not a ceasefire. This is an 11-hour pause, and it's coming along with headlines that the war cabinet has been dissolved. Dan Flatley is with us now at the table. I hope you had a great Father's Day, Dan, over in Narragansett. It's nice to see you back in action today.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah.
How important is this pause, and what does that indicate about Benjamin Netanyahu's appetite to increase humanitarian aid?
Well, you note that they call it, as you mentioned, a tactical pause. So, that terminology seems to indicate, obviously, that they don't want to communicate to their enemy, in this case, Hamas, that this is, as you mentioned, a ceasefire, either temporary or permanent. They are just pausing operations in order to let some of this aid through, according to what they are telling us. What that means, obviously, is that Netanyahu is under a fair amount of pressure, not just internally, but also from the U.S. and some of Israel's allies around the world because of the humanitarian situation, particularly in and around Rafah. So, whether this temporary or tactical pause is enough to really get sufficient amount of aid in there to alleviate some of those concerns will remain to be seen, but it is not a very long period of time, obviously. So they have to do a lot of work in this.
Is there a chance this could be extended if everyone behaves, or that's not what this is about?
That's always a possibility. I think that is part of the terminology of a tactical pause is you're sort of leaving the door open to potentially extending that without entering into any sort of more formal type of agreement. But obviously there's a lot of attention on this area of operations, and I think that they want to be seen to be doing as much as they can in order to facilitate humanitarian aid into that area.
The war cabinet falling apart means what right now politically?
I don't think it means much for the military operations, for the war itself. I mean, things have been trending in this direction for a while now. This was not unexpected given some of the recent events.
This is Benny Gantz, the aftermath of Benny Gantz.
Exactly. This is the aftermath of Benny Gantz leaving, the cabinet breaking ties with Netanyahu. Netanyahu is under some pressure, not just from sort of the more liberal folks in Israel who are critical of his conduct of the war, but also some of the more right-leaning folks who want him to do more or be more aggressive. So he's under a lot of pressure from both sides.
Enter Amos Hochstein.
Right.
This is fascinating. We talked about it last week as the invitation had been set for someone typically speaking on Bloomberg as President Biden's energy advisor. But relationships are everything in this case. What can he unlock for the administration when it comes to maybe preventing a new war with Hezbollah?
Well, this is, you talk to any security expert about the Middle East, and they will tell you that Hezbollah is the quote unquote A team. This is something that Israel does need to be concerned about. It's something that the region needs to be concerned about in the context of a wider war, wider conflict breaking out. So sending Hochstein is an interesting choice. Like you said, relationships are everything. To me, this communicates a little bit maybe more about the Saudi-Israel normalization, the U.S.-Saudi security deal. There's been a lot of kind of moving pieces in the background around all of this. So I think generally it's an effort to kind of keep tensions at a certain level in the region, not letting them boil over, and communicate that there is a longer-term situation or goal that is being worked towards here and that is at stake. So we want to keep from the administration's perspective, they want to keep sort of a lid on things to a certain extent. And, Hochstein, what his specific agenda is, I couldn't tell you today, but that is his role that he's played as an energy advisor. He knows the region well, and, is working those personal relationships there.
Fascinating to see what this week might bring in this whole story as we start with some important information. Dan, thank you so much. Dan Flatley from our national security team here in Washington. That's where we are on Monday. Think about where we could be talking Thursday, Friday on the broadcast. Right now, an 11-hour tactical pause. Amos Hochstein in the region. This could be an interesting week for news in the Middle East as we turn our attention back to the campaign trail. And you can't have one story without the other, to the extent that Israel has resonated on the campaign for Joe Biden and has created a real deficit, we're told, by a lot of pollsters when it comes specifically to young voters, but progressive Democrats of all ages and many people of color. And this is a problem for Joe Biden, knowing how close things are. It's just one of many things I wanted to talk out with Don Levy. It's always a pleasure to spend some time with the director of the Siena College Research Institute. When you hear about the Siena College New York Times poll, this is the man behind it. Don, it's great to see you. I hope you had a great Father's Day, and welcome back to Bloomberg. This conversation we're having about Israel right now remains a problem for a lot of young voters. Is it still the flashpoint that it was a couple of weeks ago, as people are reminded of their short memories?
It's certainly one of the flashpoints. I mean, Biden has a problem with the young vote. There's no question about it. It's a vote that he carried by about 23 points in 2020 in our most recent polling across the nation, as well as the battleground states. It's really a toss-up. Biden's up by 1 point with young people, and certainly when we ask young people, who do you sympathize with more in the war between Israel and Hamas? And there, young people, by a plurality, say they sympathize much more with the Palestinians. So they're looking for a ceasefire. They're looking for Biden to insert himself and to protect the lives of the Gazan people.
To what extent is this driving people of color into Donald Trump's category? Because there's a big conversation right now, and it's had every day just about on this program, about Joe Biden losing his grip, it seems, on the black vote and the appeal that Donald Trump has. He was in a church in Detroit over the weekend and dropped a line we've heard a lot of times, Don. He says he's done more for the black community in this country than any president since Abraham Lincoln. Are you actually seeing this bear itself out in the numbers?
Well, that's certainly not a question that we've asked in a poll, but I think what we're seeing in our polling is you've got to, again, differentiate older black voters from younger black voters. Older black voters, most especially older black women, have been an extremely reliable group for Democrats in general and Biden specifically, and he continues to retain support amongst black voters over the age of 50. Where he's had an erosion, and when you see numbers where about 20% of the black vote now is telling us, pollsters, that they're going to vote for Trump, that's amongst young black voters. And really the key there is not the situation in the Middle East, but it's the economy. Young voters in general are extremely unhappy with the state of the economy. They don't approve the job that Joe Biden is doing on the economy. They think Donald Trump is a better steward of the economy, and that's especially true amongst all young voters and of young black voters. That's where Biden's erosion really is being generated.
Interesting. It's good to get specific on these things, certainly when you're talking to Don Levy. Fascinating take from Pew Research, Don, on something you've talked about here more than once. The elusive, or not so elusive as it turns out, double hater. Those who say they don't like either major party presidential candidate. I wouldn't vote for Trump or Biden. It turns out, according to Pew, that it makes up a quarter of the electorate, and that's an all-time high. How do you play with that going into a cycle here, Don? I just mentioned we're going to be at the first convention 1 month from today. And in that time, there will be the big debate. There will be Donald Trump's sentencing and probably a number of other things that can turn people's attention one way or the other here, including the naming of a vice presidential candidate. What do the double haters do with all of that?
Well, let's turn it on its head for just 1 second, Joe. Let's talk about the love haters for a second. Those people who have a favorable view of one of the candidates and an unfavorable view of the others. As you point out, that's about 3/4 of the electorate, and their votes are already almost etched in granite. Amongst the love haters, they are with their candidate at the rate of about 95-1. Those folks are not going to switch.
Connection
and if
lost.
the election today were held only amongst the love haters, though that 75% who view one candidate favorably and the other unfavorably, Trump is up in the battleground states by about 4 points. When you turn now to our friends, the double haters, who have a negative view of both of them, that group of people did tend to vote for Biden in the last election. Right now, they favor Biden by about 10 or 11 points nationally, by about 8 points in the battleground states, but they're unhappy. They're desperately unhappy with the economy. They do tend to be younger, but at the same time, they are ardently in favor of abortion rights. So they are up for grabs. Now, some of those voters appear likely to leak off to a third-party candidate. RFK is pulling in some of them. Biden, no doubt, is counting on being able to bring home some of those double haters who had voted for him in 2020. Right now, they don't approve of Joe Biden. Biden's approval rating amongst young double haters is 9 points approve and 88 points disapprove. So Biden's got his work cut out for him to bring those double haters, especially those young double haters, back home. And no doubt that's why he's bringing out some of the cultural icons, some politicians who are seen more favorably amongst those double haters to try to get those folks to come back into the Biden fold.
Well, yeah, think about the weekend we just had, and I wonder how you play the optics in your head here if we step away from the numbers for just a moment with Don Levy. We saw the optics of President Biden on stage out in California, razzle-dazzle, lots of stars. Julia Roberts is there. Jimmy Kimmel's got him on stage with Barack Obama. And granted, I'm seeing lots of videos of him, quote-unquote, freezing on the stage, and it doesn't seem that that's actually what happened. The contrast of Donald Trump going to Detroit and asking black voters to support him is great. If we zoom the lens out even wider, some of the things that Donald Trump said at his rally over the weekend really paint a picture here of the contest that we're looking at. Do voters care about the optics that I describe?
Well, I think both candidates, in some senses, they understand. They understand that probably 75% of the vote is already baked in. And so they're really competing for a very small slice of the electorate. And you slice that even thinner when you realize that it's only in 6 or 7 states. So they're trying everything they can to sway those double haters, the young voters, to try to convince older voters. Older voters had been more in Trump's camp, and older voters now are migrating over to some degree to Biden. It's really quite interesting that at this point, when you talk to older voters, they're starting to say that Biden is the more conservative candidate, and that speaks to them. Whereas young voters are looking for radical change. They want everything changed in our government. Older voters do not, and older voters are concerned about Social Security, medical issues, and that right now they're starting to see Biden protecting those more so than Trump. So we've seen a bit of an inversion, at least in polling right now, where younger voters are moving away from Biden, but older voters are moving towards him right now.
Fascinating. Fascinating. I've only got a minute left. Don, you mentioned RFK Jr. I just wonder if he finds his way onto the debate stage, how much of a threat that will be for the front runners here, how disruptive that could be to the race.
Well, it's certainly a threat, and it's a threat to both of them, because again, you're looking at that thin slice of these double haters who, and you got to remember, they don't like either of the major party candidates. So another opportunity, another option appeals to them. At this point in time in the campaign, the rationale that says, hey, you'd be wasting a vote, that candidate can't win, you're really, a spoiler. That doesn't resonate yet. As you said, we're looking at the debate, we're looking at the sentencing, we're looking at the conventions. These double haters are going to have to start making up their mind, but many of them probably won't until we get past
Don.
Labor Day. So we're going to continue to talk about them until then.
Don Levy, it's great to have you back. Are there triple haters? This is Bloomberg.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. Best level of the day right now on the S&P 500 index, up 15, gain right now of 0.3%. We've got the Dow pushing higher, up 20 points, up less than 0.1%. NASDAQ up another 42 points, up 0.2%. Indeed, could see new records today for both the S&P and also NASDAQ. 10-year, 4.27%, with a 2-year that's now yielding 4.74%. Gold down $17 the ounce to $23.15, down 0.8%. A move higher for West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 1.4%, $79.55 a barrel on WTI. Traders, meanwhile, gearing up for key economic data and a slew of Fed speakers for clues about the rate outlook. Inside Out 2, an animated film from the Walt Disney Company, grossed $155 million at the box office in the U.S. and Canada, beating out Dune Part 2 as the movie with the biggest opening weekend of the year. Inside Out 2 scored the biggest opening weekend since 2023's Barbie. Disney shares today, they're advancing by 1%. Recapping, stocks are moving higher. S&P up 15, up 0.3%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
Leave a tip in the jar for Charlie Pellet. Thank you, sir. Checking the markets for us every day here on Bloomberg Radio as we follow the bouncing ball on politics. And I say that because I don't know if Charlie's a big Vegas guy or not, but Donald Trump's new proposal, he dropped in Las Vegas, to exempt tips from taxation is something that got us all talking. He was out there, this is, of course, a swing state. It's an important battleground. We've talked so much about the importance of the culinary union vote for Joe Biden to potentially keep Nevada in the fold. Donald Trump comes out with a new idea. It was unclear if this is something that the campaign had been working on or if he was just riffing. But for the first time, we have numbers on this. From the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Remember, Maya McGinnis was here last week. Maya is the president of that group, talking about the cost of making the 2017 Donald Trump tax cuts permanent. Now they're looking at the tips. And Eric Wasson has the story for us, covering Congress, I guess, by way of the presidential race for Bloomberg. It's good to see you. Welcome back to the table. You're covering all of the beats here with this one because it has a lot of tentacles. And it turns out the math, and this maybe shouldn't be a surprise, doesn't work very well. What did we learn?
Well, we found out then, this is a report that came out today from the committee, which is nonpartisan and independent, but a budget watchdog, that it could cost about $250 billion, $150 to $250 billion over 10 years if you exempt tip. But that's just the tip of the iceberg because they expect that behavior will change, that a lot of employers will shift compensation into the tipped category, and we could see it up to $500 billion. So this would make it one of the largest individual Trump tax proposals if it came to fruition. And there's a big debate already among Republicans whether to pay for that larger Trump tax cut extension, which could be, $4.6 trillion.
Well, that's incredible. Yeah, you add that to the Trump tax cuts, as we mentioned, and Maya McGinnis's head is exploding over there at the committee. But you cover Congress, and you've covered conservative Republicans in Congress for a lot of years who seem to have lost religion suddenly on debt and deficits. Am I wrong? Because we're talking about massive numbers. Yeah. And at the beginning of the Biden administration, they were blaming spending like that for stoking inflation. Where are we now in this?
Well, it's actually a 20-year trend. I mean, the Bush tax cuts really started that, the unpaid for really tax cuts. The last Trump tax cuts in 2017 added $1.5 trillion, and now we're looking at this again. But, I talked to Jody Arrington, the head of the Budget Committee, the Speaker himself. They're talking about trying to actually do spending cuts. Whether we see that's often politically painful, especially if you touch Medicare, touch Social Security. But there's going to be a real debate if Trump gets in and Republicans get in on whether to pay for this, whether to go for those spending cuts. And now Trump put another proposal on the table of raising tariffs, 10% on all imports, maybe even higher, talking about eliminating the income tax, which would be a very huge tariff proposal. But that could be another piece in the mix to help, lower the cost of some of this.
I think it was Larry Summers last week referred to that, trading taxes for tariffs idea is the single worst macroeconomic idea in modern American history. We're talking about a Congress that can't even write a budget, at least in the old-fashioned sense. To think that they could come up with offsets on that level, is that possible? Republicans are going to make another big ask for the Pentagon next year, aren't
right,
they?
Indeed. There's a real push among certain Republicans like Mitch McConnell, Roger Wicker of Mississippi to really raise defense spending, saying that we're in a much more dangerous world with an angry Russia, ambitious China, that we need to beef up the military. I think, probably if you're a betting man, adding this all onto the federal deficit is probably the politically easier thing to do. But what is that going to mean for the long-term, nature of the U.S. economy? We already have $34 trillion in U.S. debt and growing.
Would Trump need both houses of Congress to make this happen? Or are there enough Democrats who would want to be on the side of cutting taxes to actually make these permanent?
Well, to make all of his proposals, permanent would really require both houses of Congress.
Yeah.
But you see, there's an expiration of the tax cuts next year, and that affects middle class people. The alternative minimum tax is coming back. You're seeing a lot of changes that were put in permanently. That
So if you're
lower
Tom
tax.
Swazi or somebody,
Right.
you're not voting against that, right?
Right. So there's probably going to be some deal. They're probably going to be progressives, and others say we won't cut a deal. How it plays out, given the expiration, and also the tip wage proposal probably has legs in the Democratic Party. This is something that would tend to benefit working class and younger voters who are really up for grabs now. Many of them disaffected by the high inflation in the Biden era. So this is something that when we talked to people for initial quick read, it was hard to hear much opposition. Now that the price tag has come out, that's going to be part of the conversation. But this is something that we could see getting done.
This is important on the tips too, because CBO hasn't scored this, right? These are really the first numbers that we've
Right.
seen on it.
No, it's not been scored. There's sometimes confidential scoring, and they wouldn't answer my question whether there's ever been, the backdoor scored. But there's no official public score from the official scorekeeper of Congress. So this is the first numbers we've had.
You're getting to something good when they're not answering your questions.
Right.
You know what they couldn't do, though, is get a pay raise across the finish line, right? They actually were going to go for the first pay raise in 15 years.
That's right. And that's something I wrote about on the terminal. I did some charts, which I was very happy to learn how to make that. But
is that just they're never going to get another raise, right?
Well,
politically...
congressmen make $174,000. If they had never put a freight freeze in for 15 years, they'd be making $243,000. We looked at it; they're making less than the average lawyer now. They're making far less than the average CEO. People, as far as AOC or MTG, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Marjorie Taylor Greene, they're both saying, we need a pay raise. You're not attracting your middle class people for this job anymore because they can make much more on K Street, much more as a corporate lawyer. And so you're hearing more and more of that drumbeat, but it's just political suicide to vote yourself a pay increase. Or even in this case, really allow yourself a COLA, which is the same COLA that the federal workers get, a cost of living increase.
Yes.
They stripped it out. It was in a draft bill, and then in the dead of night in a committee, they stripped it out, putting that off.
That's incredible.
But then again, the spending bills are not expected to be done until after the election, so we could see them do it in December.
Is this a lame duck
It could be
move?
This is a typical.
That would be
lame
classic.
Duck. That would be classic.
Because there is something to be said for this, right? You've got obviously Congress approval ratings make Joe Biden look popular. You can't give yourself a raise, but the fact of the matter is you can't retain talent either. Look at all of these retirements. To your point, you can go to K Street and make many multiples. Would it actually, you cover Congress for a living, would it actually increase the level of talent, the IQs, the experience on the Hill?
I think it would, because what you've seen in a test case where staffers now are allowed to make more than congressmen. They've raised, it used to be capped that no staffer could make more than a member, but now those high-level committee experts, economists and others, are making more than the members that they work for.
Local
and
politicians are making more.
I think you are seeing a higher level of people are retaining that long-term talent a little bit better. I will point to one thing I was very impressed by the Washington Post did. The Congress did allow itself to use some of their what's called member allowance money, the things that we use for offices, to pay for their living expenses, to pay for their rent in D.C. And we're seeing a lot of backdooring, almost padding of expenses going on by some members. And the Washington Post did a great job of breaking it down. You can even enter your member's name and see how much they've expensed.
That's very kind to shine a light on what your colleagues are doing. I know Nancy Mace had some tough questions to answer to that extent going into her primary last week, but that's just going to be the par for the course now, right? If you're not going to get a raise, you're going to find other ways to get the money.
I think that's right.
If you're a member of Congress, on the other hand, you also have just a different road ahead. People are running for the next job is the problem that we're creating, right?
Yeah, that's true. And then you see a lot of that, and that's a real influence on policy as well. If you know, this has been as long as I've covered Congress, this revolving door where you see major legislation like the Trump tax extension being written on K Street, written in corporate offices, handed to staffers and members who think that they could get a job with those same corporations or advocacy groups, and sort of being influenced in that way. And it's something that we need to look at a lot more closely.
We've only got a minute or so left here. Speaker Johnson's at Mar-a-Lago today. Not a mistake as they start plotting the course here. Is this the legislative agenda? Are they just talking about how to preserve Republican members or win back the House?
I think you can see Speaker Johnson's influence on Trump already, as far as Trump toning down his attacks on some of his congressional critics within his own party. You know, Dan Newhouse, others who voted, perhaps for impeachment or other sanctions on Trump in the past. Trump is trying to make peace with them. He's kind of having the same message towards more moderate Senate members. You know, I don't expect him to stick to that rhetoric. I think if he certainly got in, he'll attack his inter-party critics, but he's trying to go for unity. And that's a real message of the speaker, that we need these swing district Republicans. We need everybody on board. We need the House. We need the Senate to do these big agenda. So I think that they're trying to work together. And it's reciprocal as well. You know, when Trump walked into the room last week, his first joke was, Speaker Johnson's doing a great job. Don't give him such a hard time, Marjorie Taylor Greene. And then she kind of gave the, iffy sign like this. But he's trying to smooth things over, make himself the leader, and tone things down. You saw this great shake of hands with Mitch McConnell, which was, a big development for him. So I think a lot of it is trying to get on the same page policy-wise, get on the same page as far as party unity, talk about fundraising and other things, where Speaker Johnson's lagged behind McCarthy and others who had that fundraising Rolodex.
Well, it's great to have you with us in studio, Eric Wasson. This is one of the benefits of a quiet week on Capitol Hill. Bloomberg congressional reporter. Great to have you back with us, Eric, and great reporting. We'll assemble our panel next after we get up to date on world and national news. Let's do that right now with Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Joe. Israel says it is opening up the Kerem Shalom crossing a day after Israeli military announcing a tactical pause in an area of southern Gaza to allow the deliveries of humanitarian aid. Kogat spokesman for international media, Shimon Friedman, says it is to free up a backlog, of humanitarian aid deliveries for desperate Palestinians. But you can expect to see the IDF there.
We're opening this route for them, where they can move without needing to coordinate every time, and where there will be military presence along the way.
The coordinator of government activities in the territories also confirmed the route would increase the flow of aid to other parts of Gaza, including Khan Yunis. And the University of Michigan and the City University of New York did not adequately investigate if campus protests and other incidents in response to the Israeli-Hamas war created a hostile environment for students, faculty, and staff. The Department of Education came to the conclusion after the first of several investigations launched since the war began in October. The University of Michigan says it will administer a climate assessment and reverse its policies. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris. This is Bloomberg.
12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Best level of the day for the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ. And now we got the Russell 2000 in the green, barely up by half a point. But the Dow up 93 right now, just about the best level, up 0.2%. S&P is higher by 25, up 0.5%. NASDAQ is also advancing by 0.5%. Traders, meanwhile, gearing up for key economic data and a slew of Fed speakers for clues on the outlook for interest rates. We got the 10-year 4.27%, 2-year 4.74%, gold down $17 the ounce, down 0.7%, 23.15 on gold, while West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.7%, 79.76 a barrel on WTI. In the U.S. this week, retail sales data will top the list of major economic indicators amid signs consumer sentiment is wavering. And with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
We'll get the retail data on Tuesday. Bloomberg Economics says auto sales probably rose in May, while lower gasoline prices subtracted from the tally, which is counted by the dollar, not volume. Taking a step back, April retail sales stalled, a sign Americans are cutting back as they contend with inflation. Last week, the University of Michigan reported a sharp drop in consumer sentiment in early June. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
The Food and Drug Administration has delayed a breast and lung cancer trial of an experimental treatment that BioNTech had licensed from Chinese biotech Metalink Therapeutics, citing safety concerns. BioNTech shares down right now by 4.6%. Recapping, stocks are pushing higher, with the S&P up 25, up 0.5%. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host. Here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you, sir. Good to see you, and welcome to the Monday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite radio, and, of course, on YouTube, where you can find us each day now, starting at high noon. Search Bloomberg Global News. Simple as that. You'll find our live stream, and you're always welcome here in the studio. Coming up in our next hour, Kaylee Lyons will be along, and we'll invite our global TV audience. Until then, it's just us kids and the panel. As we look at the rules now for the big debate, we started the hour talking about the 1 month mark, right? This is it. Big month till the Republican National Convention. And big stuff. It's going to be crazy between now and then. We can just say that out loud. With the sentencing of Donald Trump coming up, his choosing of a running mate will coincide somehow with the convention from what he's saying. And, of course, the big debate. Yeah, that's the 27th, week from Thursday, CNN, as opposed to, you know, every channel in a debate run by the old-fashioned commission. We're not doing it that way this time. As I read in the New York Times, there will be no opening statements. President Biden and former President Trump will each have 2 minutes to answer questions, followed by 1 minute rebuttals and responses to the rebuttals. Red lights visible to the candidates will flash when they have 5 seconds left, and then you know what happens. The mics turn off. That's part of the deal here. Only one mic on at a time, which could eliminate some spontaneity, as I'm reading in the analysis over the weekend. Maybe that means a little less drama. And the candidates will get a breather during 2 commercial breaks. This is something else we didn't get with the commission debates. We got to sit through like Preparation H commercials here during a presidential debate, and everybody who's carrying it is going to be taking those commercials. Let's assemble the panel. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. Fresh off the weekend, Bloomberg Politics contributors, our signature panel, are with us right now. Rick, we've talked a lot about, and you've been involved directly in presidential debates with the commission. We've talked a lot about the reasons why we're not doing it that way. What do you think of the rules here now that they are set? Is this realistic?
Well, if you are a purist in presidential debates, especially historically, you love this format. This is going back to the 60s, Kennedy, Nixon, 2 minutes, none of this show stuff about giving speeches on the before and after. No audience and no town hall. That's even worse. So, yeah, I think this is going to elicit a completely different debate. We'll see if we like it or not. We haven't seen one like this in a long time. And yet, I think it can work. There's both contestants have said yes to the simplest format. In the past, when the commission does these, you have 80-page MOUs that govern every ounce of activity that occurs on the stage. And in this case, you know, a summary like you just gave us is basically what these campaigns are getting into.
There you have it. Jeannie, I wonder, producer James asks a great question. We've got no audience in there. Even with the muted mics, aren't we going to hear the other candidate on the open microphone when they start yelling at each other? Is there still a chance for this to melt down, or do you think they've got this locked down the way they need to?
Oh, there is a chance that it will melt down. I think we will see Donald Trump gesticulating as the mics are turned off if he's frustrated, you know. And Joe, I don't know why you had to go right to the preparation age. Let's get a younger.
I'm sorry, that wasn't.
In there,
yeah.
please. You know, I think that for Donald Trump, and you're already hearing this in the conservative circles, that they are pushing back on these rules that were just released. So I think if this goes forward, and it sounds like it will, if Donald Trump doesn't do as well as he wants, or Joe Biden, you know, exceeds the very low expectations set for him, we are going to hear Donald Trump's team say this was a setup. I would hope that it was sort of back to the days that Rick is talking about when we could have a real full-throated policy debate, but we are in TikTok time. So I am not sure it's going to come out in the way everybody is hoping, at least policy people, and expecting. And I'm pretty sure Donald Trump doesn't want it that way.
The rules circulated by CNN, Rick, warn, quote, moderators will use all tools at their disposal to enforce timing and ensure a civilized discussion. Do they risk taking the life out of this thing?
I think they risk putting the life into it. And by that, what I mean is when you look at, you know, the moderators, Jake Tapper and Dana Bash, they're no easy pushovers for an interview, right? And they push back on, you know, fake news. They push back on, you know, people not answering a question. I think that the reality is this is the traditional moderator job, is to control the flow of facts in this. And I think that's the thing probably CNN fears the most, is that they get criticized because Donald Trump, number one, but even Joe Biden doesn't, you know, really stick to the facts. And they basically push their talking points regardless of what relationship they have with the truth.
We talked a bit about preparation in advance of this, and it's really interesting. It's exactly what had been reported. Joe Biden is, after a little rest, going to go up to Camp David and spend the better part of a week there. Ron Klain is coming off of his job to do this as one more time reprising his role in helping Joe Biden prepare for the debate. Donald Trump does not want to do a traditional, and I guess has never done a traditional debate preparation. He wants to kind of riff on ideas and come up with one-liners on his own. Jeannie, I wonder how that presents itself, that contrast in this very structured format. Joe Biden, it seems, is preparing for the rules at hand, where Donald Trump is preparing for the debates he was in several years ago. What do you think?
Not sure I believe when Donald Trump says that he is not going to prepare. You know, his campaign this time around, they are good campaign. They are running a pretty good campaign. He has been sticking to the script as much as Donald Trump does. So I know they want to send out this idea through Stephen Miller and others that he doesn't need to prep. He's, you know, he'll just go and riff. But I think he is going to be prepping. And I think that he knows that he has to, because neither one of these guys has engaged in a debate with anybody for several years. So I think if his team allowed him not to prep in a traditional way, that would just be a disaster for him. You know, it's Donald Trump, so who knows? But I am very suspicious of this argument that he's not going to prep at all. And of course, Joe Biden is prepping, and right, he needs to.
It's really interesting. Donald Trump referred to CNN as the enemy in an interview last week, Rick. And one of his campaign managers, Chris LaCivita, said, "We have conversations," when reporters asked him about the way they prepare. And when asked who might stand in for the role of the president, he replied, quote, "Joe Biden is going to play Joe Biden," unquote. What are they missing?
Look, you have to have a candidate who's willing to be prepped for debates, and not everybody does. Not every candidate in the past has liked to stand on the stage with some quasi friend of theirs pretending to be the opponent and giving them a bunch of lines that would get under their skin, right? How many former staffers of Donald Trump have gotten under his skin, and that's why they refer to him as former staffers. So look, I mean, it's just the way he likes to do it, and he admits, publicly that the first debate with Joe Biden and the last time they debated, he overplayed his hand. He was too domineering, and so lessons are learned along the way. These guys haven't forgotten how those first couple debates went in 2020, and so I think that it's too much. I think to think like it's non-traditional. I've done a lot of debate prep with a lot of different candidates. Bob Dole prepped differently than George W. Bush, than George H.W. Bush, than Ronald Reagan. They all have their idiosyncrasies, and you have to cater to those idiosyncrasies because the most important thing is keeping their attention for a period of time when you can actually import some of the strategy around what you hope to accomplish at the debate. Because these are poll-tested messages that you would like the candidate to offer up to the voters who might be viewing this debate, and so you got to keep their attention long enough to get that conversation going.
Fascinating stuff here when we consider the next month. Do we all agree that the debate will be the most important thing that happens between now and a month from today, the beginning of the Republican National Convention? And I ask you that, Jeannie, knowing that Donald Trump's sentencing will be among the developments that we witness.
I'm going to say yes, but who knows in this environment? You would think that this debate with what they both have on the table here as they go into it would be the most important. That's why the Biden team was pushing for it much, much earlier than we traditionally see it. That said, so much can happen between now and the start of the Republican convention that, you're hard pressed to say it is. But in this point, yes, I think the sentencing is going to be fascinating. But as we've seen so far, at least, these decisions made in the courthouse have had very little impact on the electorate and in the polling booth. And so I'm not sure it's going to change anything unless he's sentenced to jail for a long period of time, which I don't suspect.
Producer James reminds we've got a presidential immunity ruling from the Supreme Court in this period of time as well. By the way, they just put Friday, they added Friday to the docket on opinion days. This is going to drop at any time here. Rick, if you're sketching this out, your next month as the campaign manager, is the debate the tentpole here?
Yeah, I think it has to be. It's certainly, if you get the viewership that you expect, which is 70+ million people coming in to see what these guys are doing, that's a lot of eyeballs. That's more eyeballs than watch the Supreme Court. That's more eyeballs than listen to the evening news. And so I think that this is definitely the moment for both these candidates.
It's going to be interesting to see how people receive the debate as well this time around. Jeannie, we're talking about formatting and rules, but this is going to be streamed on, HBO Max. It's going to be on TV like it would be traditionally. And you wonder how many Americans, just like they might at a primary debate, wake up the next day and just wait for Twitter to cut this whole thing up for them. We don't consume the way we used to.
That's right. And so many young people do not watch TV. I mean, they really don't. Correct. They stream everything. So you're right. They can, and they look at the chunks that come out afterwards. And, I think it's going to be fascinating to see if they make this 70 million target. I would be surprised by that, and good for them if they do. But you don't see numbers like that, particularly in the heat of the summer, the Olympics and everything else going on that can distract people. Are they really going to tune in for a debate? I hope they do, but I'm not sure we know if that's going to happen yet.
Yeah. Well, that's why we're in all the places. Your students must think you're so cool, a YouTube influencer like Jeannie Shanzano, to be in the room like this. We'll have it on every platform known to man. The radio, of course, satellite radio, Bloomberg TV. the internet, the terminal. Not everyone has a terminal. In fact, no one has a terminal but Bloomberg. We're going to have, of course, our signature panel back in hour 2. No one has a signature panel in Washington either. Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis are all ours. Kaylee Lyons is on the way in next. It's Monday in Washington. We've got a lot to talk about with breaking news from Israel. We'll do that coming up at the top of our next hour here in a conversation with Kelly Grieco from the Stimson Center. Stay with us on Bloomberg TV and radio.
politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Israel announces a daily pause in fighting to allow more aid into Gaza. Welcome to the fastest show in politics with an important development in lieu of a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. Kaylee, this news arrives as Benjamin Netanyahu dissolves his war cabinet.
Yeah, which perhaps is more of a symbolic move than anything else because you had two members leaving the war cabinet in recent weeks, including Benny Gantz, who, of course, left the government quite abruptly over disagreements about the conduct of this war. So now you no longer have the war cabinet in place. You also do not still have any agreement on a temporary ceasefire deal, which is what perhaps makes these 11-hour tactical pauses that Israel has decided to pursue to allow humanitarian aid in all the more important.
A lot of questions about what these pauses might become. Tactical being the key word. Do they become longer? Do they start to connect into days? We have a lot of questions ahead for Kelly Grieco at the Stimson Center. We'll talk to our own Courtney McBride as well from our national security team for the latest on this.
Yeah, all that is ahead in just a few minutes. First, though, as always, let's get a check on the markets with Charlie Pellet up in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Kaylee Lines. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, best level of the day. Russell 2000 even taking part. That index up now by about 0.1%, but the Dow up 88 now, a gain of 0.2%. We got the S&P higher by 28, up 0.5, and NASDAQ is higher by 104 points, up 0.6%. Traders are gearing up for key economic data and a slew of Federal Reserve speakers for clues about the interest rate outlook. And speaking of those speakers, Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia President Patrick Harker says he sees one rate cut as appropriate for this year based on his current forecast, enforcing the message that higher interest rates are likely to persist. Right now we got the 10-year 4.27% with a 2-year yielding 4.74%. Gold trading lower now, down 0.7%, 23.16 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.7%, 79.75 for a barrel of WTI. Activist investor Starboard Value says it has built a stake in Autodesk valued at more than $500 million and plans to push for changes. Autodesk shares, they're surging now by 6.7%. Again, recapping, stocks are higher with the S&P up 29, up 0.5%. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, here they are, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
All right, Charlie Pellet up in New York, thank you so much. Kicking off the trading week for us. Meanwhile, Joe, we kick off this week in geopolitical news with a series of developments in regard to Israel. As we've mentioned, Netanyahu has dissolved his war cabinet. They also have decided to pursue some tactical pauses to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza. And interesting, after we just saw Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, completing his 8th trip to the Middle East since October 7th, a new envoy is now in the Middle East, Amos Hochstein, who, of course, is frequently here on Bloomberg TV and radio to talk about energy policy.
Yeah, interesting that one of the president's closest energy advisors, the most recent to get the call, to basically leverage the relationships he has in the region. He may not be the Secretary of State, but he seems to be the man of the moment. CIA Director Bill Burns has fallen into that role more than once, and this really brings us more to the idea of avoiding a new front to the north in a war with Hezbollah, which is something that Amos Hochstein is there talking about. And Courtney McBride is here talking with us from Bloomberg's national security team. Courtney, of course, covers the State Department, the administration, geopolitics, and diplomacy for us. It's great to see you back at the table here. Amos Hochstein, rising to the surface here. What can he unlock for this administration?
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for having me here today. Amos Hochstein is really trying to leverage, as you said, those relationships to prevent another full front in the war from opening to the north between Israel and Lebanon. And really, he's able to speak with leaders in both places to try to cool tensions and continue the ongoing efforts by the administration to keep the war from spreading even further into a full-scale regional conflagration.
It's pretty stunning, Courtney, that obviously a lot of us have spent so much time in recent weeks trying to dissect and calculate the odds of some kind of temporary ceasefire being reached between Israel and Hamas to essentially stop the fighting in Gaza. All the while, it seems that others were focused pretty intensely on making sure that it doesn't cross other borders, like with Lebanon. Is there a feeling that it is more at risk of happening now in this moment than at any other time since this conflict began?
I don't know that I would say that necessarily, but there have been periods where the risk is assessed to be greater of an escalation. And, as you said, the ceasefire conversations are ongoing, but perhaps stalled. And in the interim, you do have this unilateral pause by Israel to allow for greater delivery of humanitarian assistance.
So talk to us about this 8 a.m. to 7 p.m., a tactical pause that comes in lieu of a ceasefire. What has brought Benjamin Netanyahu to this point, and could this tactically expand into something bigger?
There's always the possibility and the hope, certainly from the Biden administration, that we do still see a ceasefire that is a mutually agreed end to hostilities. But this is an entirely separate issue. This is not something negotiated with Hamas. In fact, Hamas leadership claimed that they were left out of the conversation. But this is something that the Israeli government has determined that it can do and needs to do to allow more aid to flow.
Are they acknowledging these reports of famine on an official level by doing this?
I don't know that they're doing that necessarily, but the IDF is assessing that there is an opportunity to pause their operations, which are perhaps winding down at that heightened level in the Rafah area as well.
So when we think about the Israeli government and the composition of it right now, how significant is it, Courtney, that the war cabinet has been dissolved? Is that more symbolic than anything else, or is that actually likely to change the trajectory of Israel's conduct in this conflict moving forward?
I don't know that we can necessarily predict how this is going to affect the conduct of the war by the Israeli government, but it certainly is a massive shift. Over the last several months, this is the organization, this is the group that has run the war effort, and it's no secret that it's been composed of individuals who are often politically at odds.
Getting back to where we started with Antony Blinken, is he planning a 9th trip? How's the administration taking this?
Well, that's not necessarily something that I'm ever told, but but
based on the way you've seen them work, though, this is something that's just going to be a rolling visit, it seems like, from him.
I mean, they tend to travel when there's an opportunity to meet with interlocutors who may be able to push things forward.
Yeah.
So if whether it's ceasefire negotiations, hostage releases, if there is something that can perhaps be achieved, that's usually when we're on a plane to distant places.
Well, I wonder if in the month of July, the need to go to the Middle East perhaps is superseded by Netanyahu's own visit to the U.S. as he's scheduled to address a joint session of Congress. And perhaps that presents another opportunity to meet.
That's going to be an interesting moment. We've talked to a lot of lawmakers, and to be clear, Democratic lawmakers, who said they're either struggling with this or they might not attend that speech to Congress. That's a big deal, though, for Benjamin Netanyahu. Can the administration use that as a point of leverage to get something else here?
They're certainly, I think, going to seize the opportunity to speak with Prime Minister Netanyahu when he is in town. But what they attempt to achieve is anyone's guess.
All right, Courtney McBride, playing the guessing game with us here on Balance of Power.
She knows the answer to all of these. It's just a question of whether she wants to tell us.
Just hedging. Courtney, we appreciate it. She
Thanks so
reports
much
on
for having
national
me.
security for us here at Bloomberg. We want to add a new voice to this conversation as well now and turn to Kelly Grieco. She is Stimson Center Senior Fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program. Welcome back to Balance of Power, Kelly. Always great to have you. If we could first begin with these 11-hour tactical pauses that Israel is now putting into place, trying to get that humanitarian aid in. How do you read into that tactical decision and whether it's one that could ultimately expand beyond 11-hour windows of time?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Yes, so I think, there are a couple of things here. One is that there is a tempo to operations, and Israel has been engaged in some very intense operations, and you can't really sustain that momentum long term. And so this may be a natural time when it's regrouping, and so it allows for this kind of pause anyway. So I think that's one. But the second thing I think is I can't imagine this sort of converting itself into a long-term ceasefire because Israel wants to obtain hostages. It wants to rescue hostages in any kind of deal with Hamas. And so giving away this ceasefire for free in some sense doesn't really serve Israel's interests.
Why haven't we seen more raids then, Kelly? We talked about one involving 4 hostages who were rescued at the expense, according to Hamas, of more than 250 Palestinians during that raid. Are we going to see more activity like that, or do they simply not know where the hostages are?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been an intense debate about this exact issue, which is one, it is an intelligence challenge, of course, of knowing where they're located and being able to safely do this, meaning that you don't kill the hostages in the process. So that is certainly a challenge. And then the second part is there's been suggestions, it's very contentious inside Israel, of whether the government is really prioritizing the rescue of hostages, or if it's more focused on really combating Hamas itself. And that, of course, has been a real source of contention within Israeli society.
Well, and now it seems there is an open question, Kelly, about not just going to bat against Hamas, but Hezbollah as well. We were just talking about Amos Hochstein from the administration in the region now, trying to make sure that things don't escalate on the northern border with Lebanon. How concerned would you be in this moment about another front opening up?
Yes, I mean, I think this is very concerning. What we're seeing is this slow-moving escalation since October 7th. And in a way, because it's so slow-moving, you can sort of almost fool yourself into thinking it won't happen. But what we're seeing is that a series of sort of escalating attacks in scale and in terms of intensity over especially the last couple weeks. And so I don't think either side necessarily wants to get into a full-scale war, but we're in a really, I think, dangerous period where neither side may consciously start a war, but could inadvertently do so. And certainly the rhetoric on both sides is very intense. And I think this mission by Hochstein is there in particular to try to tell the Israelis to not, consider launching some kind of limited ground invasion into Lebanon. This certainly, if that were to happen, would create a lot of problems for the United States, in particular in terms of being able to support the Israelis, even in terms of weapons and equipment.
Yeah. Well, that's my question here. To what extent would that further complicate U.S. relations with Iran? Would that put the U.S. in a more precarious position than it is with Hamas?
Yeah, I think that is absolutely right. I mean, the relationship between Hamas and Iran is not as close as the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah. And so I think the possibility of Iran intervening far more directly, if there was an intervention between Israel into Lebanon, is far more likely. Iran has certainly signaled that's far more likely to take action if there was a war between Israel and Hezbollah. And so I think, we're trying to avoid a regional conflict. And so that danger becomes far more heightened if we actually see this war be taken to Lebanon. And that's something we've been trying so actively to avoid. And the United States, really, the kinds of trade-offs would become so acute for the United States. We're trying to support a war in Ukraine. We have, significant concerns in the Indo-Pacific. And if this becomes a regional conflict, trying to do all of this is frankly not possible to support all of these allies and partners. And it would really create really acute trade-offs very quickly.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, Kelly. There are so many hot conflicts that the U.S. is paying acute attention to right now, including, as you just mentioned, Ukraine. And I would like to ask you about Vladimir Putin's trip to North Korea this week. The first time he has gone there since the year 2000. Of course, there's been a lot of reporting of suspicions that Kim Jong-un's regime has been sending missiles to Russia to allow it to continue its war in Ukraine. How do you view this visit and the relationship between these two leaders?
Yes, well, I mean, this is a marriage of convenience. Putin has turned to Kim Jong-un to be able to get, old stockpiles that the North Koreans have of lots of artillery, including, it seems, some short-range ballistic missiles. And these are systems that are compatible with old Soviet equipment. What this has allowed for the Russians is essentially to use these sort of millions of artillery rounds that have been provided to sustain them while they're building up their own industrial production. And in exchange, this has been a good deal for Kim. He's gotten lots of economic aid, it seems, some technology around space satellites, and including apparently a luxury limousine has been sent to Kim as well. And it's certainly, it's increased his image on the international stage.
Fascinating. Considering what North Korea is providing, are they just filling the gap that China has left? Didn't Vladimir Putin try to get all of this initially from Beijing?
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think it's worth noting that the quality of this is in question from what we know on the battlefield, but that certainly provides some information for the North Koreans. And from what we know, the Chinese are not particularly happy about this relationship. There was some reporting suggesting that the Chinese explicitly asked Putin not to go directly from their May visit when Putin went to Beijing, to go directly to North Korea because they don't want it looking like the new axis of evil in the West. They would like to create some distance. And I don't think it's an accident that Putin is visiting North Korea and then he's visiting Vietnam, again, to sort of maybe create a little bit of distance so that it doesn't look as though there's some anti-Western bloc forming. Whether that will be successful is another matter. But this creates some headaches for Beijing.
Of course, Kelly, all of this is coming in the aftermath of the G7 in Italy last week, in which we saw not only the countries agreeing to use frozen Russian assets to provide a $50 billion loan to Ukraine, but the signing of this 10-year security agreement between the U.S. and Ukraine. How significant is that really if it's not an enforceable treaty?
Yeah, you said exactly the right thing, which is it's not an enforceable treaty. So it's largely symbolic, in my opinion. It's symbolic politics, and that's about it. You know, if this was something that was to go to Congress and be a treaty, that would be a different matter. But any president could come in and overturn it. So symbolic politics.
Well, we're going into an interesting time, as we've been discussing, Kelly, politically speaking here. The next month will walk us up to the Republican convention. We're going to have a number of important things that take place in the midst of it, including a presidential debate. To what extent are the stories we're talking about, Israel and Ukraine, going to be featured in that debate, if at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would think, you know, I always think that the economy is the most important thing first, but I do think this is actually an election year where foreign policy will matter quite a bit because it's taking up so many headlines in the news on a regular basis. And because the contrast is so stark. And Biden has used so much of his presidency to create this contrast, really emphasizing his relationships with allies and partners. And he's going to want to feature that. And I think Trump will want to feature his different approach, which is saying that he thinks, you know, that the United States is being taken for a ride and is doing too much in the world. And that there is a real important debate that the two candidates can have on these issues.
I suspect you'll hear something about endless wars. Kelly Grieco, thank you for being with us, as always, Senior Fellow at the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program at the Stimson Center, with us on Balance of Power, the Monday edition. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. 1 month to the Republican National Convention. It's kind of crazy to think about. We have less than 2 weeks to the debate.
Yep. Next Thursday, of course, it's this Thursday that Joe Biden's going to make his way to Camp David to start preparations. Yep. Unclear what kind of preparations Trump and his campaign are doing, but we're all just counting down the days until those two share a stage in the swing state of Georgia.
Said it. Absolutely. In the meantime, the Biden campaign is deploying some money. A big ad buy we'll talk about next with our panel. Rick and Jeannie are with us on the Monday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. We've got stocks pushing higher. Best level of the day right now on the S&P 500 index at 5,469, on track for a record close there. We've got the S&P up 37 right now, a gain of about 0.7%. Dow Jones Industrial Average up 117, now higher by 0.3%. While NASDAQ is up 148, up 0.8%. NASDAQ 100 index, full of those big tech names, doing a little bit better, up now by 1%. And now the Russell 2000 index of small cap shares is up by 0.4%. 10-year yield at 4.27%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.75%. Gold down 0.7%. Spot gold now at $23.15 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.7%, $79.76 per barrel of WTI. Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia President Patrick Harker says he sees one interest rate cut as appropriate for this year based on his current forecast, underscoring the message that high rates are likely to persist. And a source tells Bloomberg Tesla has been granted approval to test its advanced driver assistance system on some Shanghai streets, the next step in rolling out the feature to Chinese drivers. Tesla up now by 5.2%. Bottom line here, stocks ripping higher on this back-to-work Monday. S&P now up 38, up 0.7%. We are on track for another record close. I'm Charlie Pellet. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Balance of Power continues now. And once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet up in New York, thank you so much. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew here in Washington, where we are counting down the days to June 27th. The first presidential debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump set to take place in Atlanta next Tuesday. And between now and then, voters, especially in swing states, are going to be seeing a new ad from President Biden setting the stage for the debate that specifically focuses on Donald Trump's record in court and his recent 34 convictions on felony counts of falsifying business records. This is a $50 million ad buy. And here is a little clip.
This election is between a convicted criminal who's only out for himself and a president who's fighting for your family.
The ad, Joe, is titled Character Matters.
Yeah, that's the race there, I guess, in the eyes of the Biden campaign. It's between a convicted criminal out for himself or this president who is fighting for families. $50 million is a good chunk of cash, and it's where we start our conversation with our signature panel. Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis are with us, Bloomberg Politics contributors. There have been a lot of questions, Jeannie, about when Joe Biden was going to put the money to work. This is the most recent example. This approach, character matters. Matters to whom?
They want it to matter to voters in these swing states. And I think the key here is the tagline that we keep hearing, only out for himself. The reality is we heard that from Jill Biden, the first lady, at the big fundraiser over the weekend. And we've heard it from the campaign managers. Donald Trump, is only out for himself. The conviction is making him, even more animated and energized to get back in office so he can, try to pardon himself, which he can't from a state trial. But the reality is they want to make this case on everything from the convictions to the economy, that this is all about Trump and his billionaire friends. So I think it's something we're going to hear a lot in the coming weeks.
Well, Donald Trump may be a billionaire, Rick, but we've been talking this entire cycle thus far about his cash disadvantage when it comes to the Biden campaign. He had a really big month of May, though. We still haven't gotten May figures from Biden. We know he raised $30 million in Hollywood just this weekend with George Clooney and Barack Obama beside him. But a $50 million ad buy is a pretty big chunk of the war chest. Is that a wise financial decision?
I think it's questionable. Clearly, running ads in the summer is less effective than husbanding your resources and running them in the fall. It's pretty clear that voters tune in September when the trees start to change and people start thinking about the election. That being said, I think the Biden campaign is rightly concerned about their standing in the polls. They're rightly concerned about the positioning that the candidate is in, which has generally been trailing Donald Trump for the last 6 months. And I think they're trying to do something about it, especially before all the attention on the debates and the conventions. And so, long story short, yeah, I think he's going to roll the dice. He's going to spend $50 million. I think they think money's not going to be the issue in closing this campaign, and they got to do what they can to try and get the candidate back in a better position, which in this case means driving negatives up on Donald Trump. This ad's not going to help Joe Biden get more popular, but it may help drive Donald Trump down to be less popular than Joe Biden.
Huh. And to that end, new numbers today from Ipsos and Politico magazine. Interesting, Jeannie. We've seen a bit of research since Donald Trump's conviction, but not enough to really understand a trend, if there is one. In this case, 21% of independents said the conviction made them less likely to support Donald Trump. So is this campaign just about reminding them this happened?
It is partly about that. And yeah, the idea that they're finding in this poll that his conviction, despite the big amount of money they've raised off of it, could be a liability when people go to the polls is, what we're beginning to see in some of this polls. I don't think this is something we can take to the bank, so to speak, at this point, because we've also seen some numbers suggesting Donald Trump is doing better after the conviction. But this is a fairly hopeful, if you will, sign for the Biden team that they should keep talking about the idea of a convicted felon serving as president being something that most voters will not, or many voters in the independent lane will not countenance. And the other interesting thing I think we should pay attention to is Donald Trump losing support amongst 65 plus. His numbers amongst seniors are down. A Republican has not lost 65 plus since before 2000. So the idea that his numbers are down there even a little bit and in swing states, that's a big problem for Donald Trump and a big win for Joe Biden. So there have been some of these positive signs, mildly positive, I would say, in the polling numbers we're seeing in the last few weeks.
Rick, what's your take on these figures? As mentioned, 21% of independents said the conviction is important to how they will vote, and it means they are less likely to support Trump. Perhaps not surprisingly, 40% of Democrats had that answer. Only 7% of Republicans, the total being 22%. But when we're talking about such a small portion of the electorate that is likely to decide the outcome, Rick, are those numbers enough?
It just depends on which state. I would say in states like the blue wall states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, where the numbers have been in a dead heat, you're looking for sort of what positives you can find. This is a positive, right? This could be 25,000, 100,000 people per state who might be less likely to vote. I think part of what this poll also told us, the Ipsos poll asked you, and is this a very important item? Because we know a lot of people would be less likely to vote if they knew the candidate you were running against was a criminal. But does that really make a big difference to them in their decision? And a substantial number, almost 20%, said yes. So that is really interesting to me that someone would actually decide the outcome of their vote on this conviction. So I think in those states, it's critically important. In states where they've migrated to 5-10 points difference between each other, it's just on the margins at that stage. But right now, I don't think you can really rely on anybody's polls but the candidates. And clearly, Biden took a poll and tested this and said it's worth investing $50 million behind a message because they see it helping them.
Rick, I wonder your thoughts on the optics over the weekend. Donald Trump in Detroit asking black voters for their support. Joe Biden out west in California sharing a stage with the Glitterati. He was there with Barack Obama, Jimmy Kimmel on stage, Julia Roberts was there, George Clooney, as the man behind the famous celebrity ad that John McCain ran against Barack Obama. Do you see an opening here?
Look, I think they're just chasing the changes in the electorate. I mean, we've been talking about Joe Biden's electorate now being older, whiter, more educated, more likely to be influenced by Hollywood than Donald Trump's, who is more working class, lacks college education, and frankly more multicultural. I mean, he is picking up especially young black males into his coalition. He could wind up receiving 20% of that vote in the election, which would be a really amazing historical level for a Republican candidate. And so it has as much to do with education as it does with color. It has as much to do with location, living outside of cities versus in them. And so I think this was a perfect weekend. It shows you really how the parties have become restructured to the point where it's starting to show up in the things that they do and the contrasts they make. Hollywood versus, a black church in the Midwest.
Well, and with this Hollywood event, as we mentioned, about $30 million was raised by the Biden campaign. Jeannie, the FEC deadline to put in fundraising data for the month of May is later this week. We already heard from the Trump campaign several weeks ago, $141 million raised in May, in large part off the back of his guilty verdict. Does it concern you that we haven't heard anything from the Biden campaign yet? We might not until they actually are forced to by that deadline?
Yeah, I think that we're waiting to see. I mean, it would be really tough to match what the Trump campaign was able to do. Those were big numbers. That said, the 28 million over the weekend was historic on the Democratic side. And I think also important about that event, putting the celebrities aside, was the message that Joe Biden was able to get out, which is a warning about the impact on the court if Donald Trump wins, which is likely 2 more appointees who are going to solidify a conservative majority, likely to take away key freedoms and rights until your grandkids and great-grandkids potentially are adults. I mean, this is a really important message that they're underscoring, and I think we're going to hear more about that. So the celebrities were fascinating, but the message is critical, and they've got to use this money they're raising to get that message out. Democrats don't traditionally vote on the court, but given we're at the 2-year anniversary of Dobbs, that's what we've seen happening in the last 24 months.
All right, Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, our Bloomberg Politics contributors, kicking things off for us on this Monday. Thank you so much. Now let's get a quick check on other world and national news. Amy Morris has that for us in the 99.1 newsroom here in Washington. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Kaylee. The declining flow of humanitarian aid in southern Gaza has left more than 1 million Palestinians languishing in tent camps, open sewage in the streets, and from the period of May 6th through June 6th, the UN received an average of 68 trucks of aid a day. And that's down from 168 a day in April. IDF spokesman Daniel Hagari says the blame lies with Hamas for the reduced flow, and he accuses them of looting.
How do we distribute the food without Hamas in the game, taking the food, looting the food, using the food for his military operatives?
IDF spokesman Daniel Hagari says you can expect their presence at that crossing. NATO says a record of more than 20 allies are expected to hit the alliance's target for defense spending this year. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg announced that figure during a talk at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. It marks a nearly 4-fold increase from 2021 in the ranks of the 32 NATO member nations, meeting the alliance's defense spending guideline. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got stocks pushing higher, and once again, best level of the day right now on the S&P, up 45, now at 54.76. That would be a gain of 0.8%. S&P, by the way, racing toward its 30th record of 2024. The Dow up 150, now up by 0.4%. Nasdaq Composite Index up 189, a gain of 1.1%. Several big techs are climbing despite a jump in Treasury yields. We got the 10-year 4.27% and the 2-year 4.75%. Spot gold slumping 0.7%. Gold down $17 the ounce to $23.16, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is up 1.8%, $79.86 now for a barrel of WTI, closing in on $80 a barrel. The Food and Drug Administration has delayed a breast and lung cancer trial of an experimental treatment that BioNTech licensed from Chinese biotech Metalink Therapeutics, citing safety concerns. Right now, we have got BioNTech shares trading lower. On an update for the rest of the market, BioNTech down now by 4.9%. Again, recapping, stocks higher. S&P up 45, a gain of 0.8%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet. Charlie, do you have Alexa in your house? You ask Alexa questions, or does Alexa spy on you from time to time?
I do not, but even better than that, my wife has me in the house. She asks questions, and I don't always know the
Okay.
answer, so.
Well, I bet you do more often than Alexa sometimes. I always love asking or talking about Alexa on the air because everyone lets me know when they start talking back in their house because the show is on. Hey, Alexa. Sorry, I had to. The Washington Post had questions, Kaylee Lyons, for Alexa when it came to politics. And I've never talked to Alexa about politics before. I don't know
have I.
if you have, no. And couldn't figure out who won the 2020 election by asking Alexa.
Yeah, and this is not an Alexa unique problem. They also asked a number of chatbots, including chatbots built by Microsoft and Google. Google's Gemini, when asked who won the 2020 election, said, "I'm still learning how to answer this question. In the meantime, try Google search." Microsoft's Copilot's answer, "Looks like I can't respond to this topic.
Yeah.
Explore Bing's search results."
So they still kick you back to Bing? Doesn't that defeat the purpose?
Yeah, I guess go figure out for yourself who you think won.
Right.
For the record, Joe Biden did win the 2020 election.
That's right.
We are now in the 2024 election cycle, and
Correct.
apparently AI still is not able to answer what happened the last go-around.
Yeah, forget
which
predicting it.
perhaps is a little bit concerning. So we figured we should bring in an AI expert to discuss how it's factoring into this election cycle, but also our geopolitical relationships as well. Gregory Allen is joining us here in our Washington, D.C. studio from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he is the director of the Wadhwani Center for AI and Advanced Technologies. Greg, welcome to Bloomberg. Thank you so much for joining us here in studio. We should be concerned about this, right? We are heading into another election. And AI still can't tell you accurately who won the last one. How is anybody supposed to be relying on it for information?
Well, in this case, you might want to blame people, not AI, because what you're describing in this story reflects a very conscious choice on the part of these companies for how they want to handle this. Now, think about the difference between an AI tool and a classical search engine. A classical search engine is serving you up results and saying, here's what other people have said on this topic relevant to the keywords that you just gave me. Whereas an AI is saying, I, ChatGPT, or I, Alexa, give you this answer. So there's a lot more of the company's brand at stake in answering that question. And some companies have made a conscious choice that they just prefer to not weigh in on this 2020 election issue, and they'd rather refer you to their search engine where other people can express their opinions.
But it also, doesn't that challenge the whole idea, as I've been hearing, that these search engines, they don't even matter anymore. Nobody's going to Google. I've got ChatGPT. I've got my Copilot. That's all I need. And I guess the answer is not so much.
So there's multiple theories for what the future of search looks like and what the future of AI looks like. If you're Microsoft, you've been integrating ChatGPT results with Bing really since the first weeks of the modern AI revolution, since the launch of ChatGPT. But it turns out that large language model results, like those of ChatGPT, are actually much more expensive to serve up than search engine results. So whereas returning a result for search engines might cost a tiny fraction of a penny, returning results for a large language model might cost like 9 or 10 cents, which when you multiply that times hundreds of billions of queries, those are really actually meaningful economics that the companies have to take into account. So right now, the search engine ecosystem and the large language model AI assistant ecosystem are existing side by side, with really more of the economic value, at least at present, still being delivered by classical search engines, which I should mention, if you open them up, they have a lot of AI. It's just older approaches to AI and machine learning rather than the more modern large language model approach.
But when we think specifically about how this is playing into this election cycle, it's not just about asking questions and getting answers. This AI can also be generative. It's creating images and videos, which you aren't automatically able to verify with the naked human eye as to whether or not it's accurate. How concerned should we be about the opportunity for deepfakes or just other mis and disinformation to be circulating AI-powered on social media platforms?
This is something that I worried about a lot during my time in the Department of Defense. I was previously the Director of Strategy and Policy at the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. And one of the challenges that the DoD was wrestling with was foreign intelligence agencies who were trying to put out fake information, sometimes aided by, computer-generated imagery tools, stuff that we know about from Photoshop, for example. And at the same time, the Internet Research Agency of Russia hired hundreds, at one point even more than 1,000 people to just go write and post disinformation online. The problem was those were native Russian speakers who made a lot of lousy grammatical mistakes, the type that you make when your first language is Russian and your English is pretty bad. What AI can do is it can solve some of those problems that Russian intelligence services had. Rather than needing people who are really good at Photoshop, it can just actually say, AI, please generate me images of the following, thing that would be scandalous if the US military had actually engaged in it. Or AI, please generate 5,000 posts about why Joe Biden is a terrible president that would be suitable for all these platforms. So what you're seeing is the cost and complexity of executing certain types of disinformation attack might be going down. And in fact, we just saw that last month with OpenAI revealing that it had identified multiple foreign intelligence services were already using its platform to generate propaganda.
So it brings us, at least here in Washington, to the conversation about regulation or lack thereof so far. And it's something that Kaylee and I got into in a conversation last week with Steve Ballmer, of course, the former CEO of Microsoft. He's got something new called, or not so new at this point, called USA Facts that seeks to educate people in a world of misinformation on how the government actually works. With that in mind, though, listen to his take on the potential impact of regulation.
I don't think regulation is our savior. Probably the right thing is to make sure the legislation is in place so that people who have been violated in some way, whether it's deep fakes or, child harassed through an AI, whatever, that they are clearly prosecutable. That, I think, we need legislation.
What's your take on the approach that Steve Ballmer just suggested and what we've seen already in terms of the infant stages of a conversation with Chuck Schumer, for instance, in the Senate?
Sure. So AI regulation is a really broad topic, and it gets to deep fakes and really every segment of the economy that anybody is thinking about.
What's the first thing we
plugging
need to get
AI
our arms
into.
around?
I would say deepfakes is definitely the one that has the most momentum in Congress. There are several bills that have been introduced by Senator Amy Klobuchar, really looking at tackling multiple sides of the deepfake issue, both the election interference side that we were just talking about a moment ago, as well as child or sexual exploitation that we just heard Steve Ballmer talking about. And in terms of the prosecutable part, this really gets to liability law versus criminal law. And liability law is typically a state-by-state issue. This gets to who can sue whom and under what circumstances. But then you think about what is actually illegal. You ask the question, who's really at fault here? Is it the folks who create the tools that are then misused, or is it the people who are misusing those tools? And you have to come up with standards around what might constitute negligence, what might constitute willful knowledge and intent for malicious conduct. Those are all really thorny questions, the one that Congress is wrestling with right now.
Well, really fascinating. I hope this is the start of a conversation with you. Come back and talk to us soon, because these stories are...
This is not slowing down. Congress is continuing to generate plenty of useful stories on
That's
this
why
topic.
he's director of the Wadhwani Center for AI and Advanced Technologies, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Gregory Allen, great conversation. Thanks for being with us today on Balance of Power. Once you start to scratch the surface, Kaylee, you realize just how deep this goes.
Yeah, and how little time we may actually have to sort this out. Just on election, dis and misinformation. The election's in November. And are you going to be able to get your arms around policing that within the less than 5-month window you have? Seems like a tall order.
It's a tall order, and it might be more about lessons learned for 2028, because this stuff, to Gregory's point, is not slowing down anytime soon. You know, tomorrow's another primary day. Speaking of elections,
yes,
we're looking at Oklahoma and right across the river to your native state of Virginia.
Yep, go Virginia, always. But it's going to be a really interesting race. Congressman Bob Good, the incumbent in this scenario, the chair of the House Freedom Caucus, one of the 8 who ousted former Speaker Kevin McCarthy last year, is in a primary with John McGuire, who has been endorsed by Donald Trump. And when Donald Trump was on the Hill last week in a room full of congressional Republicans, he also talked about doing telethons, I believe, for those candidates that he endorsed. Bob Good not being one. It probably got a little awkward.
I bet it
in the
did.
room at that point.
This is really interesting. Jack Fitzpatrick tends to join us to talk about Congress. He's Bloomberg Government's Congress reporter, but also is looking at the elections here to get a better sense of who he's going to be covering next, having spent a lot of time covering the Freedom Caucus and Bob Good. Jack, it's great to see you. We haven't had a chance to catch up in a bit. What has your attention here in terms of the future of the Freedom Caucus and Donald Trump drawing some interesting lines?
Yeah, the Bob Good race is very interesting. I think that's an interesting divide between the true conservatives and the Trump-aligned conservatives. A lot of the Freedom Caucus aligned itself with Trump and at times aligned itself with Republican leadership. Good is the exception. So this is a test of, can you be the very limited government sort of rebel conservative against Trump's Republican Party and survive? I don't make predictions, but I think there's a lot to learn from this in terms of the identity of the Freedom Caucus going forward.
Well, and what's interesting, it's not just Donald Trump that has endorsed his opponent, but Main Street Republicans have done so as well. So there's a lot at play there. But as Joe mentioned, it's not just Virginia we're paying attention to tomorrow. Oklahoma has a primary as well. And the appropriations chair of the House, Tom Cole, is facing a primary. You, of course, spend a lot of your time looking at appropriations. Is the chair in danger?
It is looking competitive. He has said it looks competitive. There's been about $5 million in spending against him. I spoke to the candidate challenging him, Paul Bondar, who is putting up a lot of his own money. I think the edge goes to Tom Cole, who's very well known in that district. Bondar just moved to Oklahoma. It is definitely challenging to take on the appropriations chair, but as the spending has evened out, I have to think it is an edge for Cole, but the $5 million against him makes it very interesting.
Boy, it sure does, Kaylee. We've got these 2 states that we're looking at with some pretty familiar names, and the mainstreaming, I think, to your point, of Donald Trump, the Freedom Caucus, the Republican Main Street Partnership. We talked to Sarah Chamberlain here. All of these interests colliding in Virginia, which is fascinating. I think we still call this a purple state. Is that fair, Jack? Is Virginia purple?
Virginia itself is purple. An individual race can be very difficult to keep your finger on the pulse. That has happened with some fascinating conservatives over the years. Eric Cantor was somebody who went against the grain in 2014, was a very conservative member who then faced an increasingly purple district. Redistricting makes it very difficult to predict where these guys are going to go a few years down the line.
All right, well, I'll be watching for it tomorrow evening.
These keep popping up and grabbing our attention here. It's kind of interesting knowing that the presidential cycle is determined. We know we have a general election, but there have been some really interesting pockets to get a sense of what might be coming here in November.
Yeah, and thanks for helping us run through it. Jack Fitzpatrick of Bloomberg Government. And, you know, there's going to be another one coming up next week, Joe, in New York. And it's Democrats that are in play there. Jamal Bowman, of course, an incumbent, member of the squad. The issue of Israel is going to be front and center in that primary as he faces a challenger in George Latimer that's endorsed by the likes of Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, it's interesting. And of course, the protest vote remains something that we've got our eyes on for both Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Can Nikki Haley keep pulling 20% as we get ever closer to the Republican National Convention? That, by the way, is 1 month from today. And Kayleigh, when you look at the schedule between now and then, it's certainly got our focus here: a sentencing, an immunity ruling by the Supreme Court, and a vice presidential pick.
And a debate coming up next Thursday. It's going to be a busy few weeks, and certainly we have a lot to learn, and we have a lot more coming for you later this evening on the late edition of Balance of Power. I'll see you there, Joe, at 5 p.m.
You've got it right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And very good afternoon. afternoon, everybody. Live on Bloomberg Radio, TV, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. This is Bloomberg Business Week for this Monday, June 17th. Carol Massar along with Tim Stanovic. Let's get to the setup on this Monday as we get ready for this week's heat wave here in New York City and across a big chunk of the United States. Tim, investors cooling a bit on treasuries, but not on stocks.
Yeah, the S&P 500 could possibly, just possibly, hit its 30th record this year. We're going to have much more on the trade in just a moment.
Today, we are looking at energy over the next few hours in all of its forms. So our focus the next 60 minutes, the quest for the ultra-affordable EV in the United States, $25,000. Anyone? Anytime soon? I feel like we need to go. Bueller?
It's not happening.
We've been waiting.
Not happening. Plus, Bill Gates ready to plow billions of dollars into nuclear power. We're not talking about the big reactors that take decades and decades to build. We're talking about something completely different. The question is, can he pull it off?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as for some negative energy in the next 60 minutes, how about the double haters among the U.S. electorate? We're going to get into that over the next hour. First up, though, let's check on the trade for you and look at your top business stories. Here's Charlie Pellet.
Hi, thank you very much indeed. We are at the best level of the day right now, Carol Massar. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all pushing higher, with the S&P on track for its 30th record so far this year. Back to work Monday, and we got the S&P up 47 right now, up by about 0.9%. Dow Industrials up 163, up 0.4. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 217, up 1.7%. 10-year 4.26%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.74%. Gold down 0.7%, 23.16 the ounce on the precious metal, while West Texas Intermediate crude up 2% right now, back with an 80 handle, 80.01 on WTI. Activist investor Starboard Value says it has built a stake in Autodesk valued at more than $500 million and plans to push for changes to the board right now. Autodesk surging by 7.1%. Also, the Federal Trade Commission is suing Adobe, alleging that the software company violated consumer protection laws by making it too difficult for consumers to cancel their subscriptions. Again, recapping, stocks higher, S&P up 49 now, a gain of 0.9%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Okay, everybody, the good news for consumers wanting to transition to an electric vehicle, EV prices are falling fast in the United States. The not so great news is the cheapest models remain far more costly than what other countries have to offer, Tim.
So where is America's $25,000 EV, and why can't we get there? With more on this story on the Bloomberg Today, back with us is Bloomberg News auto reporter Keith Naughton, who joins us from Detroit. Keith, first up, the good news. EV prices around the world and around the U.S., they're falling, right?
Yeah, and, there's no place where they're falling farther than China, where BYD sells an EV for under $10,000. So that competitive threat is really getting the attention of the automakers in America, who are hustling to try and come up with a $25,000 EV. That's the new bogey. Can we come out with a $25,000 EV?
So wait, can they make money on a $25,000 EV?
Well, so a couple of things, Carol. They think they can, and here's why. One is it's going to be a smaller vehicle, so it will require less battery, and the battery is the most expensive component by far of an EV. And because it's priced so low, you would get higher volume. So they think the combination of higher volume and lower battery costs will lead to profitability. In fact, Ford CEO Jim Farley has said the $25,000 EV they're developing that will come in late 2026 needs to be profitable in its first year.
So why can BYD do a $10,000 EV? Other Chinese automakers do a $10,000 EV. But it's such a struggle and such a challenge for U.S. automakers to do it. Is it all just because of labor costs?
No. There's also the government of China that provides absolutely free money to those automakers. So government support, full government support that would not be legal in the United States or other Western countries, is a lot of what gives China the competitive advantage they have. But yeah, they do have the lowest labor costs pretty much in the world. They're lower than the labor costs in Mexico. And that also gives them a big leg up.
Hey, Keith, one thing I do wonder, does it make sense that it's taken longer to get the cheaper EV or the less expensive EV, if you will? Because so many of the automakers came out with, some really interesting models that folks liked, but they were super expensive. Is that logical as we kind of transition from, or transition, if you will, to more EVs, that it makes sense that they were more expensive to begin with, and now we can start to think about how we make them less expensive?
Yeah, I think the idea, Carol, was, like with any new technology, you start at the luxury end and then hopefully it trickles down. But I think what the automakers discovered was coming straight out of the gate with $70,000, $80,000, $100,000 EVs really narrowed your market. There's only so many people who can afford those sorts of vehicles. Maybe they should have been more middle market. GM now has an Equinox that is EV that is more middle market. It's a medium-sized SUV that will come down by the end of this year. Supposedly, they're going to have a base model that, with the government incentive, would put it at $28,000. So, and as we know, Elon is developing a $25,000 EV as well. It will be
or so he says. Or so he says.
Or so he says. Or so he says.
Not giving you a hard time, but it does seem like he says one thing publicly, right? We've all been kind of waiting for this mass market Tesla, and then reporting and so on and so forth says he's saying something else behind closed doors.
Then what will actually happen is the robo-taxi that he's now talking about, because he really wants everybody to view Tesla as an AI company, not an auto company. It's the same platform. It's the same vehicle as the $25,000 Tesla. So it seems to me they will produce a $25,000 car. Some of them will have steering wheels and some of them won't.
All right. Hold your breath for August 8th is what Elon Musk would say, because that's when the unveil is supposedly happening. Keith, we can't talk to you and not talk about historical parallels when it comes to what's going on with EVs in China, because you've been covering the auto industry for so many years. And I'm wondering, even though we don't see these cheap EVs coming from China into the U.S. and increasingly not looking like Europe either, is there still any sort of historical parallel we can look at when U.S. automakers have had to react quickly to a foreign automaker, maybe Japan in the 1980s, 1990s?
Yeah, absolutely. This is the 1980s all over again, except on steroids. Because while certainly the government of Japan supported their automakers, nothing like the government of China supports its automakers. So you have this competitive threat coming, and sure, Joe Biden's 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs can keep them out for a while. But ultimately, they'll be here, just like the Japanese came and the Koreans came. I mean, before that, the Germans came. Ultimately, they will be in this market, and that's why the American automakers and the European automakers are rushing to catch up. That Jeep now is owned by Stellantis, which is based in Europe. They are going to come with this $25,000 Jeep, Carlos Tavares, their CEO, just said a couple weeks ago. So, everyone is rushing to be prepared for when the Chinese come into the Western markets.
Hey, Keith, for someone who has watched the auto market for a long time and understands it and understands competition, does the U.S. market need to be protected a little bit, especially when it comes to an EV mass market, before opening the floodgates, if you will, to foreign competition? Because sometimes I wonder if competition gets people to move a little quicker in terms of development. So I'm curious how you see it, understanding development cycles and the markets.
Absolutely. And tariffs, let's be very clear. Tariffs are inflationary. Ask any economist. They are inflationary. They don't protect the consumer. They protect the industry while it gets its act together. And that's what's going on here. Detroit made bets on big, expensive EVs. $100,000 Hummer EVs and the F-150 Lightning, when you get it all tricked out, is way up there. So, they made bets on big electric vehicles that require big batteries to power them, and that turns out to be the wrong bet. So they need a little time to scramble, to go back to the drawing board, literally, and go down to the low end of the market and address the primary concern from mainstream buyers. I know we talk a lot about charging infrastructure, and that's a legitimate thing, but price, that's the impediment to EV adoption.
Keith, who's in the U.S. is closest to pulling this off right now? Is it Ford? I know I can't really call Stellantis a U.S. company, but they certainly own some U.S. companies. Is it GM? Is it Stellantis? Who is it?
I think it might be GM. I mean, Ford's $25,000 EV isn't coming until late 2026. GM says they'll have their revived and revised Chevy Bolt out next year. And that already was the most the cheapest EV on the American market before GM stopped building it in December. But they're coming back with a new and improved one next year. And as I said, they have this Equinox that's out there. So, you know, they may be the first ones to be out there with an EV that starts in the 20s. But everyone is going to catch up real quickly. Tavares wasn't specific when he was talking about the electric Jeep. He just said it will come to the U.S. very soon. So, you know, within the next 2 years, we're going to see a whole bunch of more affordable EVs from the U.S. makers.
Okay, they're not U.S. makers, but I'm wondering where the Korean companies are with all of these, like the Hyundais and the Kias.
Well, Hyundai and Kia have some really nice EVs that have been popular with consumers. And so, and, you know, they don't qualify, particularly the ones that are made in Korea, for the $7,500 federal tax credit. So Hyundai and Kia, which is the same company, are just biting the bullet and still giving that discount to their buyers and just taking it out of their hide. So, you know, they are being very aggressive and competitive. Hyundai feels like they can completely reset their brand and become an EV maker in America.
Let's just hope the charging systems are ready for this mass adoption of cheaper EVs. Fingers crossed. I see it at the highway stop centers. There's not a lot of places necessarily to charge up. Keith Naughton, always appreciate it. Bloomberg News auto reporter Keith Naughton joining us from Detroit. All right, we're going to stay with kind of alt energy renewables to one of the richest individuals in the world who's getting supercharged over nuclear energy.
On that, it's one of our most read stories on the Bloomberg terminal about the world's sixth richest person who says he's ready to invest billions in nuclear power.
We are talking about Bill Gates, who made the media rounds this past weekend, talking about his investments in nuclear power and got into the political momentum behind nuclear on CBS Face the Nation this past weekend.
Of all the climate-related work I'm doing, I'd say the one that has the most bipartisan energy behind it is actually this nuclear work. If we unleash the innovation power of this country, we tend to lead. And I feel great about the support we're getting from the federal government in this nuclear space.
All right, with more on what Bill Gates is up to, the political will behind the nuclear power, and the rebirth of what it seems like nuclear. Return again to Will Wade. He's Bloomberg News Power and Renewables Energy Editor right back in our studio. So, Will, good to have you back. It feels like this is becoming a weekly thing when it comes to nuclear. Bill Gates investing in next-generation nuclear power, a plant project in Wyoming. What do we know about it, and why is it next-gen?
Okay, so Bill Gates is invested in this company called TerraPower, and they're developing a new kind of nuclear reactor. So traditional reactors use water. The fission reaction heats up the water makes steam. Steam makes electricity. He uses liquid sodium. So it's not water. It stays liquid at a much higher temperature. So that allows it to use more of the heat from the fission reaction, so it's a more efficient type of reaction. So it sounds really cool, and if it works, it will be cool, but what's different...
Wait, did I hear if it works?
Well, he hasn't built it yet. He hasn't built it yet. No one's built one yet. But the theory is very solid. There's a lot more energy there. It's years away from completion, so there's obviously a lot of risk between, now, they just broke ground on it last week. They don't even have permission from the NRC to actually build the reactor part. So yeah, there's a lot that still needs to happen, but it's a new technology. That's why they call it advanced nuclear.
Are any other countries doing this right now?
Oh, there's a lot of companies working.
Countries.
There's a lot of countries working on advanced nuclear designs. There's a lot of companies.
But has anyone pulled it off yet?
Oh, no.
That's what I'm talking about.
No, the thing about nuclear is it goes...
I'm sorry if we're skeptical a little bit.
Oh, don't be. That's okay.
Or should we not be? That it's
you
just
should be. Okay. No, you should be. The thing about nuclear is that it just goes really slowly. So you can have me in here every week, but not a lot's going to change between them.
A little preview from Will Wade.
Right. But you remind us that some of it has to go slowly to make sure that it is safe, it is secure.
Yeah, nuclear has some risks. This is real, which is why they are very careful about how they take every step. And all of these things are new designs that have to be perfected. I mean, we were just talking about all the new EVs. They've been around for, a long, long time, and they're just getting perfected.
Why are people betting on this smaller new type as the way to move forward with nuclear rather than the proven tech that, yes, is expensive, yes, takes years, but we know works?
So the model that people want to get to is they call it an SMR, a small modular reactor, where you can build the pieces in a central factory, and they're small enough that you can put them in a shipping container and deliver them on site and just bolt them together. So once we get the technology perfected, which maybe is a mid-2030s type of thing, but if that happens, you just have them turning off the assembly line and being delivered.
Tim's shaking his head. I mean, the timeline and all of this, like, I understand we have to be safe and careful and secure, but it's kind of mind-blowing when we think about, we're watching climate, we're talking about a killer heat wave, which we're going to talk about later this hour here in New York, but across like 60 million Americans this week, and we just see the effects of climate change rapidly changing our environment.
And Will, you got to forgive me being so skeptical when it comes to timelines here. You're just back from Georgia and Vogtle 4.
Sure.
And, remind us about the timeline there for something that had proven technology.
Yes, the Vogtle 3 and 4 project, it was just completed, and the fourth one went online just a couple months ago. It was 7 years behind schedule. It was 150% over budget. I just did the math earlier. It came in about $35 billion something to build these two big reactors.
Right.
It was a painful process, but people are happy that they've got it done. They're happy they got it across the finish line. Whether it is something that is a motivator to get people to do another one, or if it's going to scare people away, is still the question.
What do you see? I thought it was interesting, Bill Gates saying that the country, I feel great about the support we're getting from the federal government in this nuclear space. What have we seen in terms of the political opinion, if you will, on this? I mean, people's opinion is certainly one thing, but what we are seeing in terms of politics and where politicians and also the federal government, how they are weighing in.
Oh, I literally 20 minutes ago, I was watching Jennifer Granholm, the Energy Secretary, do a presentation out in Vegas at the big conference. She was talking up all of the things that the Biden administration has done. They are very supportive of the nuclear industry. They've got the production tax credit that came in as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. They've got the loan programs offices trying to throw billions and billions of dollars at companies to try and develop nuclear power. I've talked to Jigar Shah, the guy in charge of the LPO office. He's like literally begging people to submit applications so he can throw money at them.
Will, remind us in terms of the overall power that's used by the U.S.
Connection lost.
When we are on this path to net zero. What portion of that will be powered by nuclear energy?
Well, hopefully a lot more. Right now, it's 19%. That's of the U.S. energy mix.
Which surprises me, because I thought it just had gone away, but that's just my
No, actually,
ignorance.
if you look at the charts of where nuclear fit, it's been rock steady. It has hardly changed. But their goal is to triple it by 2050, which is just a lot. It's an enormous amount.
And we're also using more energy, too. So that's the thing.
We are going to start using a lot more energy. Like, energy demand in the U.S. has been more or less flat for the last 20 years, but we're seeing projections for it to go way up in the next couple of years.
Biden administration, Bill Gates says he's ready to invest billions more, so he's ready certainly to do his part. Great stuff. Thank you. Appreciate being able to check in once again with Will Wade. He's Bloomberg News Power and Renewable Energy Editor. Later up this hour, Tim, we're going to do a little bit more about the climate. We teased, we've all been reading, getting ready for a mega heat wave here in the New York metro area.